Hello everyone, tonight I've got 10 special scary stories for all of you. I know many of you watch these videos to fall asleep, so before that, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Creepy Sinister, and don't forget to comment below and tell me where you're from and what time you're watching. Now get comfortable and let's begin. It was the first weekend after the first big snowfall of the year I spent completely alone. I thought the silence would be peaceful, until I realized it wasn't silence at all. My name's Leela, and this happened when I was 17, in a suburban neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio. Our street was the kind where people waved and knew each other's dogs' names. In winter it got even quieter because everyone stayed inside and the snow made every sound feel far away. That weekend my parents were out of town for my mom's work thing, and my little brother Evan was sleeping over at my aunt's. It was just me in the house for a full 2 days. The day before they left, we got the first real snowfall of the season. Evan and I went outside after school and built a snowman in our front yard, right near the walkway that led to our porch. He used charcoal from our grill for the eyes and a crooked smile, and he made me give up my dad's old red beanie for the hat. We stuck a carrot from the fridge in the middle of its face, and Evan jammed 2 stick arms into its sides like it was ready to hug somebody. When we finished, he stood on the porch steps like he was proud of it, and said it looked like it was guarding the house. That night was normal. I watched TV, answered some texts, and went to bed early because I had promised my parents I'd be responsible. The next morning I made cereal and looked out the front window without thinking. The snowman was still there, but it was closer to the porch. Not dramatically closer, but enough that I paused with my spoon in the air, trying to remember exactly where we'd built it. I told myself it probably lined and slid a little overnight. Snow settles, wind happens, but when I went outside to get the mail, I saw the tracks around it. They weren't boot prints. They were long, narrow marks in the snow, like someone had pressed 2 flat pieces of wood into it, step after step. The marks ran in 2 lines side by side, evenly spaced, leading from the yard right up to the snowman. Then they circled it like someone had paced around it, thinking. I figured it was a prank, maybe a neighbor kid wearing weird shoes, or somebody using those novelty Bigfoot prints you can buy online. I walked the tracks backward, expecting them to lead to the sidewalk or the street, but they didn't. They just stopped in the middle of the yard. The last prints were clear as day, and beyond them the snow was untouched, like the person, or whatever, had been lifted straight up. I stood there staring at the blank snow, feeling dumb and uneasy at the same time. Then I went inside and locked the door, even though I felt stupid doing it. The rest of the day I kept catching myself looking out the window like I was checking on a pet. The snowman just sat there, quiet and harmless, but it still felt like it was facing the house more than it should. When the sun went down, the porch light made its charcoal eyes look darker, like little holes in the snow. I kept telling myself it was just a snowman, but I never really believed it. That night I heard a soft tapping from downstairs while I was brushing my teeth. It was gentle and slow, like someone tapping a fingernail on glass. I froze with the toothbrush in my mouth and listened, waiting for it to happen again. It did, 3 taps, then nothing. I told myself it was an icicle dropping or the house settling, but I ended up checking the front door anyway, peeking through the peephole at the empty porch. The next morning I didn't even try to pretend it was nothing. The snowman was closer again, now right beside the walkway like it had inched forward. One of the stick arms had shifted, and it looked like it was pointing toward our front door. The tracks were back, those same long, narrow prints, and they were deeper this time, like whatever made them was heavier than a person. I called my mom and tried to sound casual, like I was laughing about it. She told me I was probably mixing up where we'd built it and reminded me not to open the door for anyone. My dad texted me a thumbs up and said, "You're fine, kiddo." Neither of them sounded worried, and I didn't want to be the dramatic teenager, so I didn't mention the footprints. We had a small indoor camera my dad used when we traveled, the kind you could set on a shelf and check from your phone. I set it up in the living room aimed at the front window and porch steps, not because I thought it would catch a ghost or anything, but because it would catch a person. That made me feel better, like there was a line between creepy and real. I went to bed around midnight with my phone on the pillow next to me, and at 2:14 a.m. the camera app sent a motion alert. My stomach dropped so hard I actually felt sick. I opened the live view, and for a second I didn't see anything except the porch light and a curtain of snow falling past it. Then my eyes focused, and I saw the snowman at the bottom of the steps, closer than it had ever been. The red beanie was almost touching the first step, and the carrot nose pointed up at the window like it knew I was watching. I stared at the screen, holding my breath. The picture was grainy, and the snow messed with the camera, so I kept blinking, trying to make sense of shapes. Then the snowman's head shifted. Not a full turn like a movie prop, just a slow, small rotation, like someone carefully adjusting it. The charcoal eyes ended up aimed straight at the window. Right after that, the tapping started again, faint but clear, coming from downstairs. 3 taps, a pause, then 2 taps, like it was matching my heartbeat. I didn't move and I didn't call out because the idea of making noise in that house felt wrong. I just sat there watching the camera feed because I couldn't bring myself to look away. I don't know how long I sat there, but at some point the camera froze for half a second and then came back. When it did, the snowman was on the porch, not at the bottom of the steps, on the porch boards, inches from the front door, like someone had lifted it up there. One stick arm was raised, angled toward the doorknob, not touching it, just hovering, and the tapping stopped. In its place I heard a faint scraping sound, like packed snow sliding across wood. I grabbed my keys and ran. I didn't even put on real shoes, just slipped into my boots and bolted out the back door into the garage like the front of the house was dangerous. I drove to my aunt's house, shaking so hard I could barely keep the car straight. When she opened the door, she took one look at my face and let me in without questions. I sat on her couch with Evan asleep in the next room and waited for my parents to come home. They got back late that afternoon, annoyed at first, until we pulled into the driveway and saw the porch. The snowman was still there, right beside the door like it belonged. My dad walked up to it and stared at the snow, and his face tightened. "Those aren't boot prints," he said quietly, and my mom covered her mouth with her hand like she was trying not to panic in front of me. My dad shoved the snowman off the porch with a shovel. It slid in a way that didn't make sense, stiff and solid, and it didn't crumble until it hit the ground. When it broke apart, the charcoal pieces scattered like little black teeth. My dad gathered the beanie, the sticks, the carrot, everything, and threw it all into a trash bag like he didn't want any of it left on our lawn. Before it got dark, my dad pulled up the camera clips. The motion alert from 2:14 a.m. was there, but the recording skipped right through the part where the snowman moved, like the camera had blinked. 1 second it faced the yard, and the next it faced the window. My dad replayed it 3 times, then stared at the screen with his jaw clenched. "That's not right," was all he said. That night around 3 a.m., our porch light clicked on by itself, and we all heard it. My dad went downstairs with his phone flashlight on, and I followed even though my mom told me not to. The porch was empty, but the tracks were there again. 2 long, narrow prints side by side, deep in the fresh snow on the porch boards, and then nothing. No trail down the steps, no trail across the yard, just 2 prints that ended in midair. My dad called the police. They walked around with flashlights, asked if we had issues with neighbors, and suggested kids were messing around. One officer even laughed when he saw the tracks and said, "Somebody's got a weird hobby." They took a report, told us to keep the doors locked, and left. The second their cruiser pulled away, the street went quiet again, like the neighborhood had swallowed the whole thing. We stayed at my aunt for a week. My dad installed brighter lights and a better camera system, and my mom kept the porch light on every night after that. Evan kept asking when we could build another snowman, and my mom would shut him down fast, like she didn't want the word snowman in the house. The snow melted, the yard turned brown again, and life tried to go back to normal. Spring came and then summer, and nothing else happened. For a while I convinced myself it had been some sick prank or some person with a weird way of making tracks, and once we took the snowman away, they got bored. That explanation was the only thing that made the world feel steady again, even if it didn't really fit. Still, every winter, the first time it snowed, I'd catch myself staring at the porch longer than I should. Last winter I came home for Christmas from college. It snowed overnight, soft and clean, covering the yard like someone erased everything. I woke up early, made coffee, and stood at the kitchen window the way I used to. At the bottom step of the porch, sitting neatly in the fresh snow, was my dad's old red beanie turned upside down like a bowl. And right beside it were 2 long, narrow prints pressed deep, as if something had been standing there in the dark, waiting for us to build it a body again. I looked back out at the yard, expecting to see more tracks, some path leading off. There was nothing, just those 2 prints at the bottom step, perfectly placed in the smooth, untouched snow beyond them. Then I realized the prints weren't facing away from the house at all. They were facing the porch, like whatever made them was still standing there, just close enough that it didn't need to leave footprints anymore. Back in that whiteout winter, I worked the night shift at a gas station. I used to think the scariest thing I'd see was a drunk customer. I was wrong. I was 19, living with my mom in a small town that basically sat between cornfields and a 2-lane highway. The gas station was right off the rural highway, the kind with 1 blinking sign, 1 hot dog roller that never really shut off, and a bathroom everyone pretended wasn't there. On clear nights, it was boring in a way that almost made you sleepy. On bad weather nights, it was just you, the hum of the coolers, and the sound of wind pushing at the glass. That night started normal. The forecast said snow, which didn't mean much where we lived because snow was just part of life. A couple trucks came through, a guy bought a pack of cigarettes and a coffee, and around midnight the roads got quiet like they always did. The only thing that felt off was how fast the temperature dropped, like someone turned a dial. By 1:30 a.m., snow was coming down harder, sideways, sticking to the windows in thick, soft clumps. I kept wiping the inside of the glass with paper towels because the heat made it fog up, and every time I looked outside, the dark looked deeper. Around 2:00, a sheriff's deputy stopped for a soda, and he told me to be careful going home because it's turning nasty out there. He said it like it was no big deal, but his face didn't match his tone. My shift ended at 2:30. I counted the register, turned off the open sign, and stepped outside into air so cold it stung my throat. The wind was loud in that open, empty way it gets out in the country, and the snow was already piling up around my tires. My car was an old sedan with weak heat and a radio knob that liked to stick, but it usually got me where I needed to go. The drive to my house should have been 15 minutes. It was one long stretch of highway, then a right onto a back road that ran past fields, then a left into town. I'd driven it so many times I could do it half asleep. That night I told myself I'd take it slow and be fine. For the first few miles it wasn't that bad. The snow made the world look smaller, like the headlights could only reach a few feet before everything turned into a white wall. My wipers struggled, squeaking over ice, and I kept the defroster blasting even though it barely worked. The road lines disappeared pretty quickly, so I stayed centered by feeling the slight dips and bumps I knew were there. Then the whiteout hit like someone dropped a sheet over my windshield. 1 second I could still make out the shoulder, and the next it was just pure white in every direction. The horizon vanished. The sky and road and fields all blended into one thing, and I couldn't tell if I was drifting left or right. I slowed down until I was crawling, maybe 15 miles an hour, and my hands started to sweat inside my gloves. I tried to turn on my GPS. The screen lit up for a second, then froze, then went black. I tapped it like that ever fixes anything, and it stayed dead. My phone was on the seat beside me, and when I looked, it showed one bar and the battery warning symbol, even though I could have sworn it was charged when I left work. I remember thinking very calmly, this is how people end up in ditches. I imagined my car sliding off into a field, and nobody finding me until morning, and my mom calling my phone over and over while it rang somewhere under snow. I told myself not to panic. I was still on the highway. I just needed to keep going straight. That's when the radio turned on by itself. I hadn't been listening to anything. I usually drove home in silence after work because my head was already full of gas station noise. But suddenly the radio clicked, the static rose up, and then it settled into a clear, calm voice like it had been waiting. "Good, and keep your speed steady," the voice said. I jerked my eyes to the radio like that made sense, then back to the road. My first thought was that I'd accidentally bumped the knob. My second thought was that it sounded like one of those emergency weather broadcasts, except it wasn't robotic. It was human, male, smooth, like a guy on late-night talk radio. I swallowed and turned the volume down. The voice didn't change. "You're doing fine," it said, quieter now but still clear. "Stay centered, don't fight the wheel." I felt my stomach tighten. I looked around like someone could be in the back seat, which is stupid, but that's where your mind goes when something impossible happens. The voice wasn't coming from anywhere else. It was the radio. I twisted the knob harder until it clicked off. The dashboard went quiet again. 2 seconds later, the radio clicked back on. "You don't have time for that," the voice said, still calm. "There's a drift ahead. You need to take the next right." My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I told myself it had to be a prank, some local station doing a weird broadcast, maybe warning drivers. But how would it be talking to me like it could see me? How would it know I was in a whiteout right now? "The next right is your best option," it continued. "Your road is blocked." I stared into the white ahead, searching for anything, a sign, a reflector, anything. I knew there wasn't a right turn for a while. The back road I took home didn't come up until later. But as I crept forward, a dark shape appeared through the snow on my right, like a side road breaking off. It wasn't marked, no street sign, just an opening in the snowbank and 2 tire tracks leading into it. My brain screamed not to do it, but the other part of me, the exhausted part, the part that wanted this to be some kind of help, thought about the word blocked. If my usual turn was drifted over, I'd end up stuck anyway. At least this was something. I signaled out of habit, even though nobody was around, and eased onto the right-hand road. The moment my tires left the highway, it felt different. The surface changed from paved to gravel, and the sound under my car went from a smooth hiss to a crunchy grind. The road was narrower and darker, like the snow was swallowing it faster. My headlights caught wooden fence posts on both sides, half buried, and beyond them was just endless white. "Good," the voice said. "Follow the tracks, don't stop." I tried my phone again, pressing the power button. It lit for a second, then shut off like it gave up. I held it to my ear anyway, as if it could magically connect to someone. "What is this?" I said out loud, feeling stupid the second the words left my mouth. "You're safe if you listen," the voice replied immediately, like it had been waiting for me to speak. "I'm directing you out." Out where? I didn't ask. I didn't want to have a conversation with it. I just wanted to get home. The road went on longer than it should have. In my head, any back road in that area would either connect to another road or dead end at a field entrance. But I kept driving, and the fence posts kept going, and the snow kept swirling so thick that the world felt like it was only my headlights and whatever was directly in them. After a few minutes, I realized something else. The snow wasn't as loud anymore. The wind that had been pounding my car on the highway was gone. It was still snowing, but the air felt muted, like the storm was happening somewhere else. "Turn your headlights to low," the voice said. I hesitated. High beams were the only thing making the road visible, but I switched them down anyway, and the glare off the snow eased. The tracks in front of me became clearer. 2 lines, steady, like whoever made them knew exactly where they were going. I asked myself who would be driving this road in a storm like this. A farmer, a plow, but there were no plow signs, no orange markers, just tracks. Then the voice said, "You're being followed." My hands tightened so hard on the wheel my knuckles hurt. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw nothing but white. I couldn't even see my own tail lights in the snow. "Don't look back," it added almost gently. "Just keep moving." That made my throat go dry. I told myself it was trying to scare me, whoever it was, but the way it said it didn't sound like a prank. It sounded like a warning. The road curved slightly left, then right, and I noticed something that made my stomach sink. I didn't recognize any of it, not a single landmark, not a barn silhouette, not a tree line, not a mailbox. In the area around my town, there were always trees somewhere, windbreaks, little clusters of dead branches. Here, it was just fences and flatness. "How far is this?" I muttered, mostly to myself. "Not far," the voice answered. "You'll see light soon." And then, like it proved it, a small glow appeared ahead. Warm, yellowish, steady. It wasn't like headlights. It looked like a porch light. Relief hit me so fast it almost made me dizzy. A house meant people. People meant a phone charger, a landline, someone who could tell me where I was. I wanted to laugh just from the pressure leaving my chest. "Pull in," the voice said. "You can rest there." The light grew closer and I started to make out a shape behind it. A building, low and wide, not quite a house. More like a small office or a shed with windows. There was a short driveway leading up to it, and I could see a metal sign out front, but the snow covered most of it. As I got closer, my headlight swept across the sign, and for a second I saw letters. I couldn't read the whole thing, but I saw one word clearly. "Welcome." That was enough to make me slow even more. It felt too staged. A building in the middle of nowhere with a welcoming sign during a whiteout on an unmarked road. "Stop at the door," the voice said. "Leave the car running." I don't know why I listened. Maybe because I had been listening this whole time, and stopping felt like the last step in a routine I didn't mean to start. I pulled up in front of the building. The snow here was strangely lighter, like it had been cleared recently, even though there were no tire marks besides the ones I'd been following. The building had one main door and a few windows with blinds pulled down. A single porch light lit the steps. The place looked maintained but empty, no cars, no footprints. I sat there with my foot on the brake, staring at the door. My breath fogged the windshield. The radio was silent for a beat. "Go inside," the voice finally said. "It's warm." I shook my head even though it couldn't see me. "No," I whispered. The radio crackled softly like a sigh. "You can't go back." That sentence hit me harder than it should have, because suddenly I realized I didn't know how to go back. I hadn't turned a single time besides the first one off the highway. I just followed tracks in a storm. If I tried to drive out the way I came, I might miss the turn completely and end up in some ditch. Still, the idea of stepping out of my car and walking into that building felt worse than staying put. I reached for my phone again, desperate. It stayed dead. I fumbled in the center console for my charger cord, but the port wouldn't work because the cord was frayed. I stared at the dashboard clock. 3:07 a.m. The radio clicked softly. "I can hear your breathing," the voice said. Every hair on my arm stood up. My lungs froze mid-breath like my body forgot how to work. I didn't open the door, I didn't move. I just sat there, staring at that porch light like it was an eye. "Get inside," it said again, and the calm tone didn't change, but something about it felt tighter now. "You're safe inside." I locked my doors, even though I'm pretty sure they already were. My fingers were shaking so badly I missed the lock button twice. Then I did the only thing I could think of. I put the car in reverse. The moment my tires started rolling backward, the radio screamed with static, loud enough to make me flinch. The calm voice cut through it, sharper now. "Don't. That was it, just one word." My car backed out anyway, slow, wheels slipping. I turned the wheel to swing around, and my headlights swept across the front windows of the building. The blinds weren't fully closed. There was a narrow gap in one of them, like someone had pulled it aside just enough to look out, and in that gap I saw a shape, a face, pale and still, pressed close to the glass. It wasn't a reflection, it didn't move like my car moved. It was just there, watching me with no expression. My stomach dropped so hard I thought I might throw up. My foot slammed the gas and the car lurched, tires spinning in snow. I got it pointed back toward the road and took off, not caring if I slid off. All I could think was, get away, get away. The radio kept hissing, the voice talking over itself now, like it was trying to stay calm but failing. "You missed your chance," it said. "You missed your turn, you missed." I reached over and yanked the radio fuse cover open with my keys, scraping my knuckles. I didn't even know what I was doing, just blindly pulling at anything. The static kept going. The voice kept going. It didn't matter what I did to the knobs. And then, as if it wanted to prove a point, the dashboard lights dimmed. The headlights flickered. My car started to lose power. I felt it in the steering first, getting heavy, then in the engine, choking like it was running out of air. I pressed the gas harder and it barely responded. The road ahead was just a narrow tunnel of snow, and I couldn't see the highway, couldn't see anything but those tracks. "Stop," the voice said, calm again. "Stop and it will be quiet." I didn't stop, I couldn't. I kept the wheel straight and begged the car under my breath like it was a living thing. Come on, please." The engine sputtered, then caught again like it remembered how to breathe. The headlights steadied. I saw a dark shape ahead through the snow and realized it was the fence line ending. The road widened slightly, and then, like a miracle, a reflective highway sign appeared on my left. I was back at the main road. I don't even remember turning onto it. I just remember suddenly being on pavement again, the tires sounding different, and the wind slamming into the car like the storm had been waiting for me outside that little bubble of silence. I looked for the turn I'd taken, but when I glanced right, there was nothing. Just a wall of snow, a ditch, and flat field beyond it. No opening, no tracks, nothing that looked like a road. My brain couldn't make sense of it, and I didn't try. I drove. A few miles down, I saw flashing lights ahead. A snowplow was pulled over with a sheriff's SUV behind it, hazard lights blinking through the white. I didn't think. I pulled onto the shoulder, threw the car in park, and stumbled out into the snow, waving my arms like an idiot. The deputy rolled down his window and yelled something I couldn't hear over the wind. I leaned closer, shaking, and told him I was lost, that my GPS died, that I ended up on some road and there was a building and someone inside. He stared at me like I was just another exhausted kid overreacting. "You're on County 6, he said, like that explained everything. "Where'd you turn off?" I pointed back the way I came. There was a road, unmarked, and the radio. I stopped myself because saying that out loud sounded insane. I saw someone in a window. The deputy's expression didn't change much. He glanced at the plow driver, then back at me. "In this weather, you probably saw your own lights," he said. "You need to get home." I begged him to just check, to drive back with me a little, to look for the turn. The plow driver shook his head and said they were clearing drifts and didn't have time to chase ghost roads. The deputy told me the same thing, but he did offer to follow me to town to make sure I didn't slide off. I drove home with his headlights behind me, and I kept checking my mirror, half expecting to see another car with its lights off, right on my bumper. But there was nothing, just snow and the steady flash of the deputy's light bar. When I got home, my mom was awake, crying, because my phone went straight to voicemail and she thought I was dead. I didn't tell her the full story. I just told her I got lost for a bit and my car had issues. Even as I said it, I kept hearing that calm voice in my head, like it had left an imprint. The next day after the storm cleared, I drove with my mom's boyfriend out to where I thought I'd turned off. We went slow, looking for any sign of tire tracks, any dip in the snowbank, any gravel. In daylight, the area looked normal. Flat fields, ditches, fences. There was no road. We drove further down, checked side roads that were actually there, even went down a couple of them. None led to anything like that building. None had a welcome sign. None had that strange, quiet feeling like the storm had stopped. For a while I tried to convince myself it was just disorientation. Whiteouts mess with your head. Maybe I took a real road and panicked and remembered it wrong. Maybe the building was a farm shed and the face was a shadow and the radio voice was just some late-night station cutting in at the worst time. But a week later, I was closing the gas station again. The weather was clear, no snow, no wind, just dark, empty road outside. I was sweeping behind the counter when the little radio we kept in the back room turned on by itself. It wasn't plugged in. I know that because the outlet back there never worked, and we joked about it all the time. Static filled the room, low and steady. Then that same calm voice slid through it like it had been there the whole time. "You missed your turn," it said softly, and this time it didn't sound like it was talking to a driver. It sounded like it was standing right behind me. This happened during our weekend at a remote cabin. Everyone was afraid of what was outside, but my fear came from inside my own house. I'm Naomi Green, and this happened last fall when I was 26. I and 3 friends rented a cabin in the mountains for a quick weekend away from work, traffic, and our phones buzzing every 5 minutes. It was supposed to be simple 2 nights, a fireplace, cheap wine, and pretending we were the kind of people who hiked at sunrise. We drove up from the city in one car, joking the whole way, and by the time we turned onto the gravel road, we were all in that excited, careless mood you only get when you know you don't have to be responsible for a couple days. The road to the cabin was the kind that makes you feel like you're doing something wrong just by being on it. Trees leaned over the path, and the sunlight kept cutting in and out through the branches like a flickering bulb. There were no other cars, no mailboxes, no houses, and not even a sign telling you where you were. I remember checking my phone at one point out of habit and seeing there was no service at all. Matt, who was driving, laughed and said, "Perfect. No one can reach us if we die." We all laughed too, because that's what you say right before you stop laughing later. The cabin itself looked like it belonged on the cover of a rental website. Dark wood, a big porch, a stone chimney, and tall windows that reflected the trees so cleanly it almost looked like the cabin was camouflaged. There was a little clearing around it, but beyond that it was just forest in every direction, thick and endless. The key was in a lockbox, just like the instructions said, and the door opened with that heavy old house sound. Inside, it smelled like pine cleaner and fireplace ash, like someone had tried to scrub away the past without fully winning. We dropped our bags and did a quick tour, the way people do even though it's the same layout every time. Living room with a big couch, kitchen with old cabinets, 2 bedrooms upstairs, and a small bedroom on the first floor that none of us wanted because it felt too close to the woods. The best part was the fireplace, with a thick wooden mantel that had little decorations on it, a couple fake candles, a small stack of board games, and a worn hardcover book sitting in the middle like it was meant to be noticed. I assumed it was some kind of cabin log or rule book and didn't touch it right away. First evening was normal. We unpacked, made pasta, opened a bottle of wine, and played a stupid card game while the sky outside turned dark. When the sun went down, it went down fast, like someone snapped their fingers, and the woods outside the windows became a solid wall. Ellie kept glancing at the trees like she expected to see eyes staring back. She's always been jumpy, so we teased her, but even I felt that slight pressure that comes with being far from everything. It's not fear exactly, more like your body quietly reminding you how alone you are. At some point, Matt stepped out onto the porch to grab something from the car, and he came back in with his shoulders tense. He said he thought he heard something in the woods, like footsteps stopping when he stopped. Luke immediately started joking about bears and killers, but Matt wasn't really laughing. He said it was probably a deer, but his eyes kept going to the window behind us like he was waiting for movement. That was the moment the mood shifted, just a little, even though we tried to keep it light. Later that night, while the others were in the kitchen cleaning up, I finally picked up the book on the mantel. It was a guest book, thick and old, with a dark green cover and a little metal plaque on the front that said Cabin Guest Book in faded letters. The pages were filled with different handwriting, different pens, little drawings, and the usual comments people leave on vacations. Beautiful place. We saw a fox. The hot tub was amazing. There were entries going back years, and flipping through them felt like eavesdropping on strangers who were all happier than they probably really were. I was smiling at one entry where someone complained about the squeaky stairs when I noticed the dates. Most were normal month, day, and year, written in all kinds of ways. Then near the back I saw the last entry. It was on the very last filled page, and the date at the top made my stomach drop because it was dated the next day. At first I honestly thought my eyes were skipping. I looked closer, tracing the numbers with my gaze, and it was still the same. Tomorrow's date, written neatly like someone planned it. My first thought was that maybe I'd misremembered what day it was, like maybe the drive had thrown me off. But I knew what day it was. We had taken off Friday. That night was Friday night. Tomorrow is Saturday. The date in the book was Saturday. Then I read what was written under it, and the air felt like it got colder around my face. It was my handwriting, not similar, not kind of like. It was exactly how I write, right down to the way my lowercase letters tilt, the way I loop my Y's, and the little slash I always put through my zeros out of habit. The entry started with Naomi, Matt, Ellie, and Luke, weekend trip. That was us. It mentioned the weather being colder than expected, which was true. It mentioned Matt burning the first batch of firewood because he used a stupid amount of lighter fluid, which had literally happened an hour earlier. I remember my fingers tightening on the book so hard my knuckles hurt. I reread the first lines over and over, waiting for my brain to correct itself. But it didn't. Every sentence was specific in a way that made it impossible to be some general guess. Whoever wrote it knew what we had done since arriving. Whoever wrote it knew our names. And then I got to the last line. I wish we hadn't gone outside after we heard the tapping. Luke didn't make it back. I swear my heart stopped for a second like it forgot how to work. I felt nauseous, like I'd just read something private that I wasn't supposed to see. I flipped the page, but there was nothing else after it. No explanation, no extra note. Just that line, sitting there like it had always belonged. I didn't tell anyone. I know that sounds ridiculous, but in that moment my brain went into this calm, locked mode where I only cared about not letting it become real. I told myself it was a prank, even though that didn't make sense. None of my friends had my handwriting, and we'd been together the whole time. The book looked old, like it had been sitting there forever, not like something someone brought in that day. Still, I slid it back onto the mantel like I'd never touched it and walked into the kitchen with a smile that felt glued onto my face. For the next hour, I barely heard what anyone was saying. I kept watching Luke, almost like I was counting his breaths, making sure he was still there. Luke was the kind of guy who never shut up, always making some comment, always trying to get a laugh. That night he kept joking about Ellie being scared of the woods, and Ellie kept throwing napkins at him, and Matt kept rolling his eyes. Everything felt normal on the outside, but inside I kept seeing that line in the guest book like it was carved into my brain. When it was time for bed, I was the last one awake. The cabin got quiet in that deep way cabins do, where you can hear the building settle and the wind touch the walls. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the little sounds that felt louder than they should have. I checked my phone even though there was no service, just to see the time, and it was 2:58 a.m. in glowing white numbers. I kept thinking, if something happens, I'll stop it. I'll wake everyone up. We won't go outside. We won't do anything that leads to that entry. The next morning was almost worse, because daylight makes you feel silly for being scared. We made coffee, ate toast, and Matt suggested we go for a hike to a lookout point he'd seen in the cabin binder. Ellie didn't want to, but Luke made fun of her until she agreed. I wanted to scream no, but I didn't want to sound insane, so I just said I wasn't feeling great and might stay back. Luke laughed and told me to stop being dramatic, and Matt said we could just do a short trail. In my head I kept hearing, I wish we hadn't gone outside, and I didn't know if that meant outside at night or outside at all. I ended up going because the idea of being alone in the cabin made my skin crawl, and I figured daylight would be safe. The hike was normal, leaves crunching under boots, cold air in your lungs, the smell of damp earth. We took pictures and joked around, and when we got to the lookout, it was honestly beautiful. For a while I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing, like maybe I'd fallen asleep and dreamed I saw that entry. But every time Luke stepped too close to the edge or ran ahead on the trail, my stomach tightened like a fist. We got back in the late afternoon, tired and hungry, and the rest of the day passed in little pieces. Snacks, music, a board game, and Matt trying to get the fireplace going again. The mood stayed light, but I kept catching myself watching the mantel when nobody was looking. The guest book sat there like it was watching me back. A couple times I thought about grabbing it and tearing out the page, but something about that felt like making it more real, like admitting the book had power over us. That night after dinner, we were sitting around the living room with the fire going. Outside, the windows showed nothing but black trees and faint reflections of us moving inside. Luke was sprawled on the rug, half asleep, and Ellie was scrolling through photos on her phone even though nothing would load. Matt was poking the fire and complaining about the smoke. Everything felt almost peaceful, and I started to think maybe the entry was wrong. Maybe it was just some sick joke from a previous guest who somehow knew my handwriting, even though that still didn't make sense. Then we heard the tapping. It was faint at first, like a small pebble hitting glass. 3 quick taps against one of the living room windows. We all looked up at the same time. Ellie sat up straight and said, "Did you hear that?" Another tap came, a little louder, and Luke immediately smiled like he'd been waiting for this. He got to his feet and said it was probably a branch, but the window was a good 8 feet off the ground and there weren't any branches that closed. The tapping happened again, but this time it wasn't random. It was steady, like someone knocking with a knuckle. Tap, tap, tap. Matt stood up and looked toward the window, his face tightening the way it had the night before. Ellie moved closer to me on the couch, gripping my sleeve. Luke, of course, walked straight toward the window like this was entertainment, and he pulled the curtain aside just enough to peek out. He froze for a second, and all the blood drained from his face. I whispered, "What is it?" But he didn't answer. He just kept staring, breathing shallowly, like he didn't want whatever was outside to hear him. Then he let the curtain fall closed again and stepped back slowly. Matt asked him, "Luke, what did you see?" And Luke shook his head and laughed once, but it sounded forced, like a cough. He said, it's probably nothing, it's too dark, I couldn't tell. The tapping moved to another window, that's what made my skin go cold. It wasn't just at one spot, it was like something was walking along the outside of the cabin, testing the glass. Tap, tap, tap. Ellie started crying quietly and Matt told us to stay away from the windows. Luke kept acting like it was a joke, but his eyes were wide and shiny. Then the tapping stopped, and for a few seconds everything was silent except the fire crackling. That's when we heard it at the front door, a soft scrape like fingernails on wood, followed by a slow knock. Not loud, not angry, just deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Matt grabbed the fireplace poker and held it like a weapon, even though it looked ridiculous. Ellie was whispering, call someone, and I told her there was no service, but she tried anyway, hands shaking so badly she could barely hold her phone. Luke suddenly said he was going outside. I stood up so fast I almost knocked over the coffee table. I grabbed his arm and said, no, don't. I didn't explain, I couldn't, but my voice sounded desperate enough that everyone looked at me. Luke yanked his arm away and said, I'm not letting some raccoon mess with us all night. Matt told him to sit down, but Luke was already walking toward the entryway like he had something to prove. The knock came again, a little harder this time, and Luke flinched. He paused with his hand hovering over the doorknob, then looked back at us like he expected us to stop him. I felt my mouth go dry. I wanted to tell them about the guest book right then, to scream the words out and make them listen, but it felt impossible, like I'd be admitting I believed it. Instead, I just said, please, just don't open it. For a second, he listened. I saw the hesitation in his face, the part of him that knew this wasn't normal. Then something hit the door from the outside, not a knock, a shove. The whole door rattled in its frame, and Ellie screamed. Matt stepped forward with the poker raised, and Luke stumbled back. The cabin went dead silent after that, like whatever was outside was waiting for our reaction. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Even the fire seemed quieter. Luke swallowed and said, in a small voice I'd never heard from him before, okay, I'm not going out. All backed away from the door and stood in the living room together like a herd of animals pressed into a corner. Matt whispered that we should stay up all night if we had to. Ellie kept trying her phone, crying harder every time it showed nothing. I kept staring at the mantel, at that guest book sitting there like it already knew how this ended. The tapping started again, softer now, like whoever or whatever was outside had calmed down. And then from somewhere upstairs we heard a slow creak. All four of us snapped our heads toward the stairs. The cabins upstairs wasn't huge, just 2 bedrooms and a tiny bathroom, and we had all been downstairs for the last couple of hours. The creak happened again, followed by another, like careful footsteps on old wood. Matt whispered, is someone up there? And nobody answered him because nobody could. Footsteps moved closer to the top of the stairs. I don't know why, but that was the moment I believed the guest book completely. Not because of the tapping or the door, but because the fear shifted. Everyone had been afraid of what was outside, but now the dread was coming from inside the cabin, from the place we thought was safe. Matt told us to stay together, and he started up the stairs with the poker, moving like each step might break. Luke wanted to follow him, but Matt snapped at him to stay back. Matt reached the top and turned the corner, and for a second we couldn't see him anymore. The cabin felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath. Then Matt called down, there's nobody up here, and I let out a shaky breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. He started coming back down, and for a split second I thought maybe we were okay. Then I saw something behind him. It was just a shape, darker than the dark hallway, standing perfectly still at the top of the stairs. I couldn't make out a face. I couldn't even tell if it was a person. But it was there, and it was close enough that if Matt had turned his head, he would have seen it. My whole body locked up, and I couldn't speak. Ellie's nails dug into my arm so hard it hurt, like she saw it too. Matt reached the bottom step and turned to look up, and the shape was gone. He frowned, like he felt something, like he knew something had been there, but he didn't say it. He just came back into the living room, breathing fast, and told us we were leaving. Right now, no waiting until morning, no packing everything neatly. We grabbed our coats, our phones, and our keys, and we rushed out the front door all at once, not looking around, not wanting to see what might be standing in the yard. The cold air hit my face like a slap. The woods were still, too still, and the darkness felt thick enough to touch. We sprinted to the car, stumbling on the uneven ground, and Matt fumbled with the keys so badly he dropped them once. When the headlights finally flashed on, I saw movement at the edge of the light just beyond the trees. Something stepped back behind a trunk like it didn't want to be seen clearly. I didn't wait to figure out what it was. Peeled down the gravel road, tires spitting rocks, the cabin shrinking behind us. Nobody spoke for a long time. Ellie was sobbing. Luke stared straight ahead like he was in shock. Matt's hands were clenched so tight on the steering wheel his arms shook. I kept waiting for something to appear in the rearview mirror, for headlights to follow us, for a shape to run alongside the road, but there was nothing, just darkness and trees. We didn't stop until we hit the main road and finally got a weak bar of service. Matt called the sheriff's office, but by the time a deputy said he could check it out, we were already miles away and too scared to turn back. We ended up at a cheap motel, all 4 of us crammed into one room, sitting with the lights on until the sky started to turn gray. The deputy called later and said the cabin was empty, the doors were locked, and there was no sign of forced entry. He suggested maybe an animal had been scratching around and we'd worked ourselves up. His tone made it clear he didn't believe any of it. None of my friends ever went back to that cabin, and we didn't talk about it much afterward. The group chat went quiet. Weekend plans stopped happening. It's like that night put a crack in all of us, and we just pretended it wasn't there. I never told them about the guest book. I told myself it didn't matter anymore because Luke didn't die, the entry was wrong, and maybe we dodged whatever it was. But a few weeks later, after life had mostly returned to normal, I found something in my suitcase that I swear I didn't pack. It was the cabin guest book, same dark green cover, same faded plaque. It was heavier than I remembered, like it carried extra weight now. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely open it. I flipped to the last page, expecting it to be blank or different, expecting proof that I'd imagined everything. The entry was still there, dated the next day in my handwriting, but the last line was different. It said, "We made it out, but I don't think we were ever alone after that." Under it, in fresh ink that looked like it had just dried, was a new date, tomorrow's date again, waiting for the next entry like it already knew my hand would be the one to write it. This happened on a cold January night. I thought the tapping on my window was just branches, but it was. I was 17 then. I lived with my parents and my little sister in an old two-story house outside a small town in western Pennsylvania. It had creaky stairs, drafty windows, and doors that only latched if you lifted them. In winter the cold never fully stayed outside, and that night was the coldest it had been in years. After dinner we heard the furnace kick on like normal, then shut off with a heavy thunk from the basement. My dad went down with a flashlight and came back looking annoyed, like he was trying not to worry us. He said the pilot would light, but the heat wouldn't stay running. He promised he'd call someone in the morning, and my mom kept saying, just one night, dragged out 2 space heaters, one for the living room and one for the upstairs hallway. My dad lit the fireplace, and downstairs felt okay, but upstairs stayed cold, like the heat refused to climb. My parents told me and my sister to wear extra layers and sleep, because the roads were bad and there was nothing we could do until morning anyway. I went to bed around 10:30 p.m. in sweatpants, a hoodie, and 2 pairs of socks, and I wore a beanie like I was camping. My room faced the backyard, and snow was already blowing sideways through the streetlight. I shut my blinds most of the way, crawled under 2 blankets and a quilt, and tried to ignore how cold the air felt in my lungs. At some point I heard my dad try the furnace again, heard it click on, then die the same way. I woke up later because my toes were numb and I could see my breath. I pulled the blanket tighter and tried to go back to sleep, but then I heard a tapping at my window. It was steady and close, like a fingernail against glass. My brain tried to explain it away until I remembered my window was on the 2nd floor and there weren't any branches near it. The tapping came again in a pattern, tap, tap, pause, tap, like it was waiting. I sat up and stared at the blinds, and the tapping stopped the moment I moved. That should have been a relief, but it was. Felt like whatever was out there had heard me and paused on purpose. I checked my phone and saw it was a little after 1 a.m., and the screen glow made the room feel even darker. I slid out of bed and crept over on the cold floor. I pulled one blind slat aside just enough to see the glass. The yard looked empty and the snow made everything fuzzy, but the window itself looked wrong. Frost was forming on the inside of the glass, spreading from the corners in white veins toward the middle. It moved too fast, crawling across the pane like it had a mind of its own. The air in my room felt sharper with every second it spread. The tapping shifted closer to the middle of the pane, slow and patient. A small circle cleared in the frost, like someone had wiped it from the inside. I heard a faint sound from the other side of the glass, like a slow exhale, and the cold in my room suddenly felt deeper. I realized I was holding my breath, but I still couldn't make myself move. Then a face pressed against the glass. It looked like a real person pressed up close, forehead and nose and mouth flattened against the window. The skin looked pale in the streetlight, almost bluish from the cold, and the eyes were open wide, staring straight at me through the tiny gap in my blinds. The smile came slow and calm, like it was happy I finally noticed. The lips left a wet smear in the frost, like it was breathing into my room. My brain kept insisting it couldn't be there because no one could reach a second-floor window without a ladder. But the face didn't move away, and the tapping started again right beside its cheek. This time it sounded like a knuckle, tap, 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 and the smile widened enough for me to see teeth. I stumbled backward and hit my bed frame hard enough to shake the mattress, and that snap of sound finally broke me loose. I ran into the hallway and hammered on my parents' door until my dad opened it, half asleep. I said there was someone at my window, a face right there, and I could hear my voice shaking. My dad didn't laugh or brush it off. He grabbed the baseball bat from behind the dresser and told my mom to stay with my sister. I followed him down the hall even though my mom told me not to. When my dad flipped my light on, the inside of my window was coated in thick frost. In the middle was a clean oval spot, and in that clear spot was a wet smear, like where a forehead and nose had been pressed. My dad muttered, "What the hell?" and yanked the blinds all the way up. There was no face outside, just snow and darkness, and no ladder or footprints anywhere near the house. He shut the window, locked it, and told me to grab a pillow and sleep on the floor in my parents' room. My dad tried calling the police, but the call kept dropping, and when he finally got through, the dispatcher sounded overwhelmed. She said the roads were a mess and that patrol cars were tied up with crashes and downed lines. If someone forced entry, she said, call 911. Otherwise, someone could come by when they could. It didn't feel like help. It felt like we'd been put on a waiting list. The house suddenly felt very far away from everyone else. We stayed in my parents' room with the door shut. My dad sat in a chair with the bat across his knees, staring at the crack under the door like he expected a shadow to pass. My mom tried to calm my sister down, whispering that it was just the storm, just the cold. I didn't correct her because I didn't have words for what I'd seen anyway. Not long after, we heard a creak in the hallway outside the bedroom door. Not the random pop of an old house settling, but a slow step, then another, closer, careful. My dad eased the door open a couple inches and stared into the dark hall. The space heater glow made the shadows flicker, and for a second it looked like something stood near the top of the stairs. Then the glow shifted and it was just coats swaying on a hook. My dad motioned for me to stay back, but I followed him anyway as he stepped into the hall. We checked my room first, and the frost was still there, thicker, like it had been feeding. Then he moved to my sister's room, and her window was frosting from the inside too, the same white veins crawling toward the center. My sister was asleep on her side, facing the wall, completely unaware. My dad crossed the room and pulled her up into his arms without waking her all the way. The moment he did, the tapping started on her window, soft and slow, like someone using a fingernail. I tried not to look, but my eyes did it anyway. On the other side of her glass, pressed closed, was the same face, pale and flattened, smiling like it had been watching her sleep. This time it lifted a hand, and the fingers moved like it was waving. My dad slammed her blinds down so hard a couple slats cracked. He carried her back to his room, and my mom cried quietly into her sleeve. My dad didn't say much, but his whole posture changed, like whatever calm he'd been forcing was gone. That's when the tapping started again, faint and muffled, coming from downstairs. We went down together, and the kitchen air hit us like cold metal. The tapping was coming from the basement door, and the knob moved slowly, like someone on the other side was testing it. My dad raised the bat and yanked the door open, and a blast of air surged up, colder than the storm outside. In his flashlight beam, I saw barefoot prints on the dusty steps leading up toward us, but there was nobody on the stairs. The basement smelled like damp earth and something clean and icy, like a freezer that had been left open. My dad slammed the door shut and locked it with shaking hands. My sister started crying, and my mom covered her ears and whispered for her to be quiet, like sound would make it worse. My dad tried 911 again, and for a second it connected, but the line crackled with static and then dropped. He stared at the dead phone, then said we were leaving. We ran to the truck and piled in, still wearing whatever we'd grabbed. As my dad backed out, I looked up at my bedroom window without meaning to. Behind the frosted glass, a pale oval shape was there again, like something pressed close and watching us go. We drove to the 24-hour gas station off the highway and stayed under the bright lights until morning, because it felt like the only safe place nearby. My dad didn't let us sit near the windows, and every time the door chime rang, my chest tightened. I kept staring at the security monitor behind the counter, half expecting to see that pale face staring back. When we finally went back after sunrise, the house looked normal, quiet under fresh snow. My dad searched every room with the bat, but there was nothing missing and no signs of anyone inside. When he opened the basement door again, he froze at the top of the stairs. On the concrete floor below, a thin sheet of ice spread out like a spill that had instantly frozen. In the center of that ice were 5 long fingerprints pressed so deep they looked trapped, like someone had put their hand into water right before it froze solid. We replaced the furnace a few days later, and my dad installed motion lights, new locks, and thicker windows. He told neighbors it was a bad night with the cold, and nobody questioned it. I tried hard to convince myself it was just a person outside, some sick prank timed with the storm, but nothing about it fit. Frost doesn't crawl across the inside of sealed glass, and footprints don't climb stairs and end where there's no one standing. The worst part was the smile, because it didn't look angry. It looked patient. I'm 24 now, and winter nights still make me listen for that rhythm. The last time I visited my parents' house, I finally slept in my old room because there wasn't anywhere else. The heater was working and the room was warm, and I told myself I was being stupid for even thinking about that night. Then I saw a thin line of frost creeping along the inside bottom edge of my window, slow and careful, like it remembered exactly where to start. A second later, something tapped softly against the glass in the exact same slow pattern. I didn't pull the blinds this time. I just lay there and listened, because I already knew it was smiling on the other side. During the blizzard that hit early, I was staying in a basement apartment. At first, the noises upstairs seemed normal, until I realized they weren't coming from upstairs. I'd only been living there for about 3 months, renting from an older couple who lived on the main floor. The place was cheap, which was the only reason I could afford it after moving to the edge of a mid-sized city for a new job. My windows were those half-height basement windows that looked out at someone's ankles and the underside of a porch. It wasn't cozy, but it was quiet, and quiet was all I wanted after work. That afternoon, my phone kept buzzing with weather alerts. Winter storm warning, then blizzard watch, then a bigger one that said travel would become dangerous by nightfall. I remember standing at my tiny kitchen sink, watching the sky go that flat gray color that makes everything outside look unfinished. The couple upstairs were already stomping around, moving things, and getting ready like they'd been through this 100 times. The first weird sound happened around 6 p.m., right when I was heating up a microwave dinner. It sounded like footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom, slow and heavy, like someone was packing. At first I didn't think anything of it, because the stairs down to my unit were right next to their laundry room upstairs. I figured they were just walking back and forth, maybe carrying something. But then it happened again, only closer. It sounded like someone was in my unit, not theirs. The steps stopped right outside my door, and I held my breath without realizing I was doing it. A second later, there was a soft tapping, like knuckles against the wood, once, twice, 3 times. I stood there staring at the door with my fork halfway to my mouth. The tapping stopped and the footsteps moved away, toward the back wall where my bathroom was. The strange part was, my bathroom shared a wall with their kitchen upstairs. If they were walking around, it should have been above me, not beside me. I told myself it was pipes. People always say pipes make noises in old houses, and this place was definitely old. But I'd lived there long enough to know what the pipes sounded like, and it wasn't this. These were clean, steady steps, like a person who knew exactly where they were going. I texted the landlord, my upstairs neighbor, asking if they were doing something in the basement. He replied almost right away. "Nope, we're in the living room watching the news. You okay down there?" I typed back that I was fine, just hearing stuff, and I stared at my phone like it could explain why my hallway sounded occupied. The storm got worse fast. By 8 p.m., the wind was throwing snow against my little windows so hard it looked like white smoke. The couple upstairs knocked on my door and asked if I wanted to come up for coffee and to talk about the weather. I said no, trying to sound normal, because I didn't want to admit I was freaked out by noises I couldn't prove. After they went back upstairs, the house settled into that muffled, snowy quiet. That's when the footsteps came back. This time they weren't in the hallway. They were above my ceiling, but not like normal upstairs footsteps. They sounded spaced out, like someone walking in slow motion, stopping every few steps as if listening for something. I lay on my couch with the TV on low, trying to ignore it. Then I heard the same knuckle tap again, only it wasn't at my door. It was at one of the basement windows. I sat up so fast my blanket fell off. The tapping was faint, like it was coming through glass, but it was unmistakable. Someone was outside my window. I didn't have a view, not really. Those windows were level with the ground, and a small concrete well filled with snow sat outside them. If someone stood there, I'd only see their knees or their boots. I got up and stepped closer anyway, my heart hammering like it had a reason to. In the dim light from the street, I could see snow sliding down the glass. Then, for just a second, a shape blocked the light. It was tall and close, like someone leaning over the window well. I waited for a face to press against the glass or a hand to wave. Nothing happened. The shape moved away, and the light came back. I backed away from the window, and my first instinct was to call the upstairs couple. Then I heard their living room TV turn off and their footsteps go toward their bedroom. I didn't want to sound dramatic, not over a shadow and some tapping. But I also didn't want to sit there all night wondering if someone was outside, trapped in the storm with nowhere else to go. That's when I remembered something my coworker had told me earlier that day. If the roads got bad, the city might shut down transit, and the last bus out to my friend's place across town would be early. My friend Marissa lived in a newer apartment building with underground parking and security doors. She told me more than once that if I ever felt uncomfortable in my basement unit, I could crash on her couch. By 9 p.m., the weather alert on my phone said, "Avoid travel." But it also said the worst of it would hit after midnight. If I was going to leave, it had to be soon. I grabbed my backpack and shoved in my charger, a hoodie, and my keys, and I pulled on boots and a thick coat. The hallway outside my unit felt colder than usual, like the house had opened its mouth and let winter in. I stepped out into the backyard and felt the wind slap me across the face. Snow was already up to my ankles, and the streetlights looked like they were underwater. The bus stop was about a 10-minute walk on a normal day. That night, with the wind and snow, it felt like I was wading through a white wall. The whole time I walked, I kept looking back, expecting to see someone following in my footprints. All I saw was my own trail filling in behind me like it didn't want to be remembered. When I reached the stop, I stood under the small metal shelter and tried to calm down. My gloves were already damp and my eyelashes felt stiff. A city bus finally appeared through the snow, its headlights cutting a narrow tunnel in the white. The digital sign on the front showed the route number and a destination that looked right, at least at first. The bus slowed and hissed to a stop, and the doors opened with that familiar groan. Warm air spilled out like a sigh, and I climbed inside without thinking twice. There were already a few passengers sitting scattered around, all of them quiet, all of them facing forward. Not sleepy quiet either, more like don't talk here quiet. The driver was an older guy in a dark jacket, his face half shadowed under the brim of a hat. I flashed my pass and mumbled hello, but he didn't respond. He just looked past me like I was a bag of groceries someone left on the seat. I sat about halfway back near the window and wiped fog off the glass with my sleeve. Outside, the storm blurred everything into moving gray. The bus pulled away from the curb, and I remember feeling a small wave of relief, like I'd escaped something back at the house. At least here there were other people. At least here there were lights. The bus made 2 normal stops, but nobody got on or off. At one stop, I saw a person standing in the snow with their hood up, but the bus didn't even slow down. We rolled past them, and the person didn't wave or chase after us. They just stayed there, facing the street like they were waiting for something that wasn't coming. I checked my phone to text Marissa that I was on my way. The message didn't send. I glanced at the signal bars and saw nothing, like my phone had forgotten what a network was. I told myself it was the storm messing with service. Still, something about being cut off like that made the bus feel smaller. We reached the part of the route where we were supposed to turn toward the main road. I knew this because I'd taken this bus a few times before, and there was a gas station on the corner with a giant neon sign. But when we got to the intersection, the bus didn't turn. It went straight into a darker stretch where the streetlights were farther apart and the snow looked thicker. At first I thought maybe there was a detour. That happens in storms sometimes. But there were no orange cones, no flashing hazard lights, and no signs warning about closed roads, just empty sidewalks and trees bending in the wind. The bus kept going, steady and calm, like it was following a route only it knew. I leaned forward and tried to catch the eye of the woman sitting across the aisle from me. She looked like a tired mom, maybe in her late 30s, with a puffy coat and a knit hat pulled low. When our eyes met, she immediately looked away, fast, like I'd burned her. Her hands were folded tight in her lap, and she didn't move except to swallow. A few minutes later, the bus passed a road sign, and something in me tightened. The sign wasn't one I recognized. It listed 2 town names in white letters, the kind you see on the edge of highways, except the names were wrong in a way I can't explain. Not I've never heard of them wrong, more like these words don't belong here wrong. One of them was Lark Hill, and the other was Cedar Hollow. They sounded made up, like names from a book. I told myself it was a county road sign, maybe for smaller towns outside city limits. But I'd lived in this state my whole life. I'd driven around plenty. I'd never heard of either one, and I definitely hadn't seen them on any map. The snow got heavier, and the bus felt like it was moving through cotton. The tires made a low crunching sound that never changed, like we were stuck in the same patch of road no matter how far we went. The windows fogged up again, and when I wiped them, I could barely see anything besides trees and long stretches of unlit road. I stood up and walked toward the front, trying to look casual. The bus was warm, and the heater rattled under the seats, but my skin felt cold anyway. When I got close enough, I said, "Hey, sorry, are we detouring? I'm trying to get to," I almost said Marissa Street, but suddenly I didn't want to speak it out loud. The driver didn't look at me. His hands stayed locked on the wheel, and his eyes stayed forward. After a few seconds of silence, he lifted one finger and pointed at a small printed sign taped to the plastic barrier near his seat. It said in plain black letters, "Do not distract driver." No other explanation, no eye contact, just that finger slow and stiff. I went back to my seat, feeling stupid and exposed, like every passenger had watched me and judged me. But nobody even turned their head. They sat still, staring forward like mannequins someone forgot to finish. Another sign came up a while later, and this one made my stomach drop. It said Cedar Hollow again, with an arrow pointing right, and underneath it, in smaller letters, it said population, 0. That didn't make sense. Town signs don't say that. And even if some abandoned town existed, why would it have an official population sign like that? I pulled out my phone and tried to open maps. The screen loaded for a long time, then showed a blank grid with no roads, just a blue dot floating in nothing. When I zoomed out, the dot stayed in the center, like it didn't know where to place itself. It was like my location was outside the world my phone understood. I started watching the bus's interior instead of the road. That's when I noticed something else that felt wrong. None of the passengers had any snow on them, not on their boots, not on their shoulders, not even on the cuffs of their pants. I'd walked through snow up to my ankles just to get to the stop. My boots were wet and crusted white, but they looked like they'd stepped onto the bus from a clean, dry hallway. The woman across from me kept staring straight ahead, her eyes wide but unfocused. A guy in the back wore a work jacket like a mechanic, but his hands were spotless. An older man near the front had a scarf wrapped around his neck, but it wasn't moving at all, not even with the bus's vibrations. Everything about them looked normal until you stared too long, and then it started to feel like a picture pretending to be real. At one point, the bus passed under a streetlight, and the light flashed across the driver's face. I only saw it for a second, but it was enough. His eyes looked pale, like they didn't have color, and his mouth was set in a straight line that didn't look human-friendly. It looked like a mask trying to remember how to be a face. I tried calling 911. The call didn't go through. I tried again, and this time it rang once and then cut off. I looked around, debating whether to say something to the other passengers, but something stopped me. It was the feeling you get when you're in a room full of people and somehow you still know you're alone. The bus slowed down and I thought, finally, we were stopping somewhere, but we didn't pull up to a normal stop. There was no shelter, no signpost, and no sidewalk, just a wide shoulder of road and a shape ahead that looked like a building made of darkness. As we got closer, the building resolved into what looked like an old bus station. Not like the modern one downtown with glass doors and bright signs. This one looked like it belonged in an old photo, with faded lettering and big windows covered in grime. The bus pulled up to the curb like it had done it 1,000 times. The doors opened and cold air rushed in so hard it made me gasp. One by one, the passengers stood up and walked off. No one said goodbye. No one hesitated. They just moved like they were being called. The woman across from me walked past without looking at me once, her face blank, her steps steady. I stayed in my seat, frozen, watching them disappear into the station. The snow outside wasn't swirling like before. It was falling straight down, slow and quiet, like the storm had paused to listen. The driver didn't turn around. He didn't announce the stop. He just sat there with the doors open, waiting. I forced myself to stand and step into the aisle. The floor felt like it tilted slightly, and my stomach rolled like I was on a boat. I walked toward the front, and as I passed the driver's seat, I noticed the name tag clipped to his jacket. It wasn't a normal name tag with a first name. It was a small white strip with numbers and letters, like a code. Outside the bus, the air was so cold it burned. The station's windows reflected the bus's headlights in a dull, dirty way. Above the entrance, there was a sign that should have had the station name, but the letters were mostly peeled off. Only a few remained, enough to form something that didn't look like any place I'd ever heard of. It looked like the sign itself didn't want to be read. I stepped inside and the smell hit me first. Old dust, damp concrete, and something metallic, like a penny held too long in your mouth. The lights inside were on, but they flickered, making the room pulse between bright and dim. There were benches lined up and a big schedule board on the wall with rows of destinations. Every destination on the board was wrong. The names didn't match any city I knew, and some of them looked almost normal but slightly off, like someone misspelled reality. And then I saw one line that made my throat go tight. It listed a departure time in words, and next to it was a destination that wasn't a town. It was my street name. I stared at it, trying to make sense of how my street could be on a bus schedule in a place like this. My street wasn't even a main road. It was a quiet residential street with mailboxes and kids' bikes. But there it was, printed like it had always been a stop. I turned and looked back at the passengers who'd gotten off. They weren't sitting on the benches. They weren't checking the board. They were standing in a loose group near a hallway marked exit, all facing it, all still. The way they stood reminded me of people waiting for an elevator, except there was no door, just a dark opening. I heard the bus doors hiss behind me. I spun around and saw the driver stepping off the bus for the first time. He moved slowly, not like an old man, but like someone trying to copy the motion from memory. He walked toward the station entrance, and when he passed under the flickering light, his face looked even flatter, like the shadows couldn't find anything to hold on to. I didn't know what I was thinking. Maybe I thought if I went back onto the bus, it would take me home. Maybe I thought staying with the bus was safer than staying in that station. I rushed back outside, my boots slipping on packed snow, and I grabbed the edge of the door as I climbed the steps. The inside of the bus was dark now. The overhead lights were off. The only light came from the dashboard glow and the faint spill from the station behind me. And every seat was empty, which should have been a relief, except it felt wrong, like the bus had shed its skin. I hurried to my seat and reached into my pocket for my phone again, still no signal. I looked out the window, and that's when I realized the snow had stopped completely. The air outside was still, no wind, no falling flakes. It was like the storm had never existed, except everything was covered in white. I heard footsteps behind me and turned, expecting the driver. Instead, the doors were closing, not hissing closed like normal, closing slowly, silently, like someone was pulling them shut with careful hands. I ran forward and shoved my palm against the glass, trying to stop it, but the doors met and locked with a heavy click. For a second, I just stood there, breathing hard, staring through the glass at the empty curb. Then I saw movement in the station doorway. The passengers were there, lined up behind the driver, all watching the bus, not watching me. Watching the bus like it was an animal they were waiting to see leave. The driver raised his hand and did something I'll never forget. He pointed, not at the road, not at the station, but directly at me. Just one finger, slow and steady, like he was picking me out of a crowd. Then he turned and walked back into the station, and the others followed, disappearing into that dark hallway like they belonged to it. The bus engine started and the whole vehicle shuddered. I stumbled back into the aisle as it pulled away from the curb. I screamed for the driver to stop, even though I knew he wasn't there. My voice sounded small in the empty bus, swallowed by the heater's low rumble. The station faded behind me, and then it was gone, swallowed by white. The road ahead looked familiar again, and that made it worse. I recognized a curve, then a row of trees, then the outline of a billboard I'd seen 100 times. The snow started falling again, the wind came back, and within minutes it was like we were back in the storm, back in my city, back in the real world. The bus stopped at my original bus stop like nothing had happened. The doors opened with that normal hiss, warm air spilling out behind me. I stumbled off into the snow and almost fell onto the sidewalk. I turned around to look at the bus, expecting to see the silent driver in his seat. But the driver was different now, different jacket, different face. He looked at me with a confused expression, like I was the weird one. I ran home without thinking. I didn't care about the wind or the snow or the aching cold in my lungs. I just needed walls and locks and something that felt like mine. When I got back to the house, the couple upstairs were awake, watching TV like before, like time hadn't moved. They asked why I was back so soon, and I told them I'd just decided to stay. I didn't tell them about the station. I didn't tell them about the schedule board with my street on it. I didn't tell them about the way the passengers moved like they were being led somewhere. I just went down to my basement unit, locked my door, and sat on my couch with every light on. The noises didn't come back that night. No footsteps, no tapping, nothing. The storm raged outside until morning, and the world looked normal again when the sun finally came up. Part of me wondered if I'd panicked, if the cold and fear had made me imagine things. But then I remembered the schedule board, and I knew my brain hadn't made up details that specific. 2 days later, when the roads were clear, I went online and looked up the bus route I'd taken. The schedule showed the normal path, the normal stops, and nothing about detours or old stations. I even called the transit office and asked if any routes ran out past the city limits during the blizzard. The woman on the phone said no, and then, after a pause, she asked me what route number I'd been on. I told her there was silence on the line, the kind that makes you check if the call dropped. Then she said carefully that route number hadn't existed in over 15 years. She said they retired it after an accident in a storm, and they never used it again out of respect. When I asked what kind of accident, she told me she wasn't allowed to share details and suggested I file a request online. That night I emptied my coat pockets onto my kitchen table, keys, a gum wrapper, loose change, and my bus pass. And then I saw something I hadn't noticed before, a paper ticket folded once like the kind you get on older buses. I didn't remember getting it, but it was there, slightly damp, edges worn. On the front, in faded ink, it had a destination printed in plain letters. Not Marissa's neighborhood, not downtown, just my street name. And under it, in smaller letters, it said one way. I still live in that basement apartment, and I still take the bus sometimes, but I never ride during a storm anymore. Because every time the wind starts howling and the snow turns the streetlights into blurry halos, I find myself listening for tapping at the window and wondering if that last bus is still out there, quietly making stops in towns that don't exist, waiting for me to get on again. Around the winter, I filmed my frozen lake recording vlog, and I started getting strange notifications from my security camera. The weird part was, the camera wasn't even plugged in. I know that sounds like it doesn't match the whole ice fishing thing, but it's the honest truth. I was living alone in a small rental outside a town in northern Minnesota, the kind of place where everyone has a truck and the grocery store closes early. I just got into recording little outdoor vlogs, mostly for fun, mostly because winter up there gets quiet in a way that messes with your head. When you go days without real conversation, you start talking to your own camera like it's a friend. The security camera was something I bought after my cousin told me break-ins were getting more common out in the rural areas. It was one of those cheap plug-in ones, nothing fancy, and I never finished setting it up because the Wi-Fi in my rental was awful. One night, when I was already in bed, my phone buzzed with a push notification that said, "Motion detected." I remember staring at it in the dark, waiting for the app to load, then realizing the camera was still sitting in its box on my kitchen counter, not even taken out. I told myself it was a glitch, deleted the app, and went back to sleep. The next day I got another notification. This time it wasn't motion, it was sound detected. That was when I actually got up, walked into the kitchen, and stared at that unopened box like it was a live animal. I peeled back the top flap and saw the camera inside, still wrapped in plastic, the cord neatly tied, and the little manual untouched. There was no way it could have been doing anything, and yet my phone had acted like it was. I should have thrown it away right there. I didn't. I did what I always do when something makes no sense. I tried to make it make sense. I reinstalled the app, thinking maybe it was picking up a neighbor's device or something. The app loaded up a blank screen that said "No device connected," and I felt a little relief, like the universe had corrected itself. A week I decided to go ice fishing alone on a lake about 40 minutes from my place. I'd been there once with my uncle years ago, and I remembered it being wide, flat, and quiet, surrounded by pine trees that looked black against the snow. The forecast said it would be clear all day, no wind, just cold. I packed my auger, my little pop-up shelter, a folding chair, a thermos of coffee, and my old GoPro, because I figured I'd record myself just to kill time and maybe upload something later. I got to the lake in the early afternoon, parked near a plowed access point, and walked out with my gear. The ice looked solid, but it still felt wrong to trust your body weight to a frozen sheet that could hide anything underneath. Every step made a faint squeak, like dry styrofoam rubbing together. The sky was this washed-out pale blue, and the sun looked weak, like it didn't want to be there. I set up farther out than most people would. It wasn't because I was brave, it was because I wanted to be alone. There were a couple other fishermen closer to shore, little dark dots near their trucks, but out where I was it felt like I had the entire lake to myself. I drilled my hole, popped up my shelter, and started filming, talking quietly into the camera about the weather, the ice, and the kind of fish you can catch out there. At first, it was actually peaceful. The shelter muffled the outside world, and the only sounds were the faint creak of ice and the soft slosh of water under the hole. I remember checking my phone at one point and seeing another sound-detected notification, and I laughed out loud because it was so stupid. I was miles away from my house. Whatever was going on, it couldn't touch me out here. That was the first thought I regretted. Not long after that, I heard a noise outside the shelter. It was light and rhythmic, like someone dragging something over snow. At first, I assumed it was the wind pushing loose ice crystals around, but I had checked the forecast, and there was barely any wind at all. Then it stopped, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the sound had. I froze with my hand still on my fishing rod. I waited for another sound, something that would confirm it was nothing. Instead, I heard a single step. Not a crack or a shift in the ice, but an actual step, slow and careful, like someone trying not to be heard. I remember holding my breath and listening. My heart was beating so hard it made my ears feel full. The step came again, closer this time, and I realized it was circling my shelter. Whoever it was, they weren't walking in a straight line past me. They were moving around me like they were looking for an opening. I didn't yell out, I didn't unzip the door and confront them. I did the most common stupid thing a person does when they're scared. I convinced myself I was imagining it. I told myself it was one of the other fishermen coming over to ask how the bite was. I forced out a casual "hey," like my voice wasn't shaking. No one answered. The steps stopped right behind me. That's what made my stomach drop, because the back of the shelter was only thin fabric. Whoever was out there was close enough that if they leaned in, they could press the wall against my shoulders. I sat perfectly still, staring at the little frost patterns on the inside of the fabric, listening for breathing. I swear I heard something. A slow, wet inhale, like someone had been running and was trying to quiet themselves. Then there was a soft tap, just once. Not on the door flap, but on the side of the shelter near my head. I grabbed my phone and pretended to check something, mostly because I wanted light in my hands. The screen glowed against the dim inside of the shelter, and right then, I got another notification. Sound detected. It wasn't from the camera at my house. The app was still open from earlier, and the screen still said "no device connected." But the notification banner dropped down like it didn't care, like it was coming from something else. I stared at it, and this cold wave of panic washed over me because the timing was too perfect. Whatever had been happening at home was happening again, right when someone was outside my shelter. The tapping came again, a little faster, like impatience. I couldn't take it anymore. I reached forward, unzipped the door flap in one quick motion, and stuck my head out. There was nobody there. I looked left, then right. The lake was flat and empty out where I was. The nearest fishermen were still closer to shore, and they weren't looking at me. No one was standing behind my shelter. There were no fresh footprints circling it, just my own tracks from when I'd set everything up. I stepped out anyway, forcing myself to do a slow circle around the shelter like I was proving something. The snow was clean and untouched, no drag marks, no prints, no sign that anyone had ever been near me at all. The air was so still it felt fake. I told myself the ice must have shifted and made those sounds. I told myself I'd gotten paranoid because I was alone. I crawled back inside and tried to focus on fishing, but the calm was gone. It felt like the shelter had gotten smaller, like the space was pressing in on me. After that, I started talking more to the GoPro, but it wasn't for the vlog anymore. It was because it made me feel less alone. I narrated every little thing I did, like if I kept a steady voice, the fear wouldn't get worse. I said stuff like, "All right, I'm gonna pour some coffee, and no bites yet, and it's getting colder." I even laughed at my own jokes, even though they weren't funny. Then at some point, I heard my name. It wasn't loud, it wasn't a shout across the lake. It was a whisper, so close it sounded like it was inside the shelter with me. It said, "Scott." I snapped my head around so fast my neck hurt. Nothing, no shadow, no movement, just my breath fogging in the air and my own eyes wide in the dim light. I stayed out there longer than I should have, mostly because I didn't want to admit I was scared enough to pack up early. But as the afternoon faded and the sky started to gray, I finally had that heavy instinct that told me to leave. I turned off the GoPro, stuffed it into my jacket pocket, and hurried through tearing down my shelter with clumsy, cold hands. The whole time I kept glancing out at the open lake, waiting to see something moving toward me. As I walked back toward my truck, I heard a crack from the ice behind me. Not the normal small pops you hear sometimes, but a deep, sharp crack that echoed across the lake like a gunshot. I stopped and looked back, expecting to see a fracture line spreading. Instead, I saw something that made my legs go weak. There was a person standing out there near where my shelter had been. They were far enough away that they looked like a dark cutout against the snow. They weren't waving, they weren't walking, they were just standing still, facing me. I stared for a long second, trying to understand how they could be there when there had been no tracks and no sound. And the worst part was the way they were shaped, same height as me, same build, same bulky winter coat. I didn't wait to confirm it. I hurried to my truck, tossing gear into the bed without organizing it, my hands shaking so much I dropped my auger once. When I got inside and slammed the door, the cab felt too quiet. I looked out through the windshield, and for a second I thought I saw that figure a little closer. Then I blinked, and it was gone. The drive home felt like I was being followed even though no one was behind me. Every set of headlights that appeared in my rearview mirror made my throat tight. When I finally got back to my rental, I didn't feel relief. The house looked normal, but normal didn't mean safe anymore. I carried my gear in, locked the door, and kept all the lights on. Later that night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and the GoPro plugged in. Part of me didn't want to watch the footage. It felt like tempting fate, like if I looked too closely at what happened, it would look back. But I told myself I was being dramatic. I told myself it would be boring footage, and I'd laugh about it later. At first, it was exactly what I expected. Just me talking into the camera inside the shelter, rambling about fishing and the weather. The audio was mostly normal too, just my voice, the faint creak of ice, and the soft slosh of water. Then I got to the part where I had started feeling uneasy, where I forced myself to talk more. That's when I heard it. Under my voice, barely there, like it was coming through a wall, was another voice. It was whispering, slow and strained, like someone trying not to cry, and it was saying my name. Scott. I paused the video and replayed that part. My skin prickled all over. I turned up the volume. The whisper was clearer now, and it wasn't random. It was following my sentences, like it was trying to speak at the same time as me, but from a different place. Sometimes it sounded like it was right behind my ear. And it sounded like me. Not exactly like me now, but like me, older, like the same voice after years of cigarettes and sleepless nights. There was this roughness to it, a tired edge, but it was unmistakably my voice pattern. The way it rose at the end of words, the little pauses, even the slight nasal sound I've always hated. I kept listening, leaning closer to the laptop like that would help. The whisper wasn't just saying my name. It was saying short phrases, buried under my own narration. And the more I replayed it, the more I understood what it was saying. Scott, stop, do. I scrolled forward a little to the moment when I heard my name inside the shelter. On the video, you can see me snap my head around, eyes wide, frozen. Right before that happens, the whisper gets louder, like it's right next to the microphone. Scott, it says, terrified, don't turn around. And then right after my head snaps, my normal voice on the video says, casual and confused, did somebody just say my name? The whisper answers immediately, overlapping my words. It's Maine, it says, it's you. I sat back so hard my chair scraped the floor. My hands were shaking, my mouth felt dry. I watched that part again, and this time I noticed something else. When I snapped my head around, the shelter wall behind me shifts slightly, like someone brushed against it from the outside. It's a tiny movement, the kind you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. I went cold because I remembered circling the shelter and seeing no tracks. I remembered how empty the lake looked, but the video didn't care what I remembered. The video showed a wall moving like something had been there. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the laptop on my bed, replaying the whisper, trying to convince myself it was some weird audio glitch, but the words were too clear. The timing was too perfect, and that voice sounded like my own fear. The next morning, I checked my phone and saw 3 more notifications from the security camera app. Motion detected, sound detected, motion detected. I hadn't opened the box, I hadn't plugged it in, I hadn't even put batteries in it because it didn't have any. I finally called the non-emergency police line, mostly because I didn't know what else to do. The officer I spoke to sounded bored, like he'd heard every weird story people could tell. He asked if I had signs of forced entry or missing items. I said no. He told me it was probably a software bug and suggested I reset my router. When I told him about the lake footage, he went quiet for a second, then just said, "If you feel unsafe, stay with a friend." I didn't have anyone close enough to just show up at their house, so I did the next best thing. I drove into town, bought a new smoke detector, a deadbolt, and another camera, one that ran on batteries, and I installed it that same day. I kept telling myself that if there was a real person messing with me, I'd catch them, and if it was all in my head, then at least I'd feel a little better. That night, I sat on my couch with the TV on low, trying to act normal. The new camera was mounted in the living room corner, pointed at the front door. I kept checking the live feed on my phone, watching the same empty room I was sitting in. Every time the heat kicked on, I flinched. At some point, my phone buzzed again, another notification. Sound detected. But the new camera hadn't picked it up. The notification was from the old app. The camera is still in the box. I stared at the banner, my stomach twisting, and without thinking I opened the app. The screen loaded slowly, like it always did on my bad Wi-Fi. I expected to see no device connected. Instead, a video thumbnail appeared, like a saved clip. It had a timestamp for just a few seconds ago, and the preview image was black, like the camera had recorded in the dark. My finger hovered over it for a full minute before I finally tapped play. The audio started first, and I heard my own breathing, close and uneven, like the microphone was right next to someone's mouth. Then that older version of my voice whispered, so clear it made my eyes water, "Scott, I'm still out here." And in the faint background of the recording, beneath the breathing, I could hear the same sound I'd heard on the lake. Slow footsteps on snow, circling, patient, getting closer to the door. It was the first time I spent completely alone while house-sitting for my aunt during that huge winter storm. I thought the silence would be peaceful, until I realized it wasn't silence at all. My aunt lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood outside of Buffalo, the kind with wide driveways, detached garages, and those curved streetlights that make everything look slightly orange at night. She had asked me to stay there for a week while she flew to Arizona to help my cousin with a newborn. I was 24, had a remote job, and figured it would be an easy break from my tiny apartment. The storm was supposed to be a couple inches, which is what they always say right before it turns into a problem. By the time the first night rolled around, the couple inches had become a full-on whiteout. The wind slammed snow against the windows like someone was shaking a sheet of gravel. The power flickered twice, and my phone kept buzzing with weather alerts and school closings. I remember standing in the kitchen with a mug of instant cocoa, watching my aunt's backyard disappear behind a wall of white and thinking it was kind of cozy. Then I noticed the sounds. At first, it was just normal house stuff. The furnace kicked on. The fridge made its little humming noise. The old house settled and creaked, which didn't surprise me. But around 10:30 p.m., when I turned off the living room lights and started heading upstairs to the guest room, the creaks changed. They didn't sound random anymore. They sounded like weight shifting, like someone taking slow steps. I stopped halfway up the stairs, one hand on the railing, and listened. Another creak came from the hallway above me, then another, like the floor was answering my pause. I told myself it was just the house reacting to the temperature dropping. Old wood, old nails, nothing spooky. Still, I ended up locking the deadbolt, then checking the back door too, even though my aunt had already told me the neighborhood was safe. I slept badly that first night, not because I was scared, but because the wind was loud and the guest room curtains kept fluttering from a draft. Around 3:05 a.m., I woke up to a sharp tapping sound. I held my breath and listened, expecting it to be a branch against the window. It happened again, but it wasn't on the window. It was lower, like it was coming from the wall near the floor vent. I leaned out of bed and put my ear close to the vent grate. The tapping stopped. After a few seconds, I heard a faint scratch, like something dragging across metal, and then nothing. I told myself it was the duct expanding and contracting. I said it out loud, quietly, as if hearing my own voice would make it true. Then I rolled over and forced myself to stop thinking about it. The next morning, the storm had backed off, leaving the world looking smoothed over and unreal. The driveway was buried. The street was buried. You couldn't even tell where my aunt's lawn ended and the road began. The only sign of life was the distant groan of a snowplow somewhere down the block and the occasional crunch of someone's shovel hitting packed snow. I made coffee, then walked around the house checking windows like I was doing an inspection. I noticed something weird right away. The side door that led into the garage had a thin line of snow along the bottom edge inside the frame. Not a lot, just a little dusting, like it had been opened and shut quickly during the storm. I stared at it for a long time, trying to remember if I had gone into the garage the night before. I hadn't. I opened the door and stepped into the garage. It smelled like cold concrete and gasoline. My aunt's SUV sat inside with a thick crust of snow on the windshield, even though it was under a roof. That made sense if the wind had blown snow in through the cracks, but it still felt off. I checked the big garage door, expecting to see a gap, but it was shut tight. The side window was frosted over from the inside like a ghostly white film. I left the garage and told myself to stop looking for reasons to freak out. Around noon, I decided to dig out the driveway. My car was parked at the bottom near the street, and it looked like someone had dropped a small hill on top of it. I put on my boots and gloves, grabbed my aunt's shovel, and started carving out chunks. The snow was heavy, the kind that sticks in clumps and makes your arms burn after 5 minutes. I could hear other people shoveling up and down the block, metal scraping and plastic crunching, but I couldn't see anyone over the high snowbanks. After maybe 20 minutes, I got to the area near my driver's side door. I shoved the shovel down and hit something solid. It wasn't the dull thud of packed snow. It was a hard, sharp stop, like hitting wood or stone. I pulled the shovel out and tried again a few inches to the side. Same thing. It was too low to be my car and too far away from the curb to be a mailbox post. I crouched and started clearing with my gloved hands. The snow was packed tight, and underneath it was an icy layer that looked like it had melted and refrozen. I scraped at it until my fingers hurt, then used the edge of the shovel like a chisel. After a few minutes, I exposed something dark. At first, I honestly thought it was the corner of a trash bag that had gotten buried. Then the wind shifted, and I saw it wasn't plastic. It was hair. Not a little tuft like an animal. It was long, dark hair, matted and wet-looking, stuck to something beneath the ice. My stomach dropped so fast it felt like missing a step on stairs. I froze in this weird half-crouch, staring at it, trying to make my brain come up with any normal explanation. That's when the snowdrift moved. I didn't scream, I didn't even breathe. The mound in front of me lifted slightly like a slow inhale, then sank back down. It wasn't a collapse from my digging. It was an up and down motion, gentle, controlled, like something underneath was breathing through the snow. My throat went dry. My first thought was, someone's alive under there. My second thought was worse, because it hit right after that. If someone's alive under there, why haven't they tried to get out? I stood up too fast and stumbled backward. The shovel slipped from my hand and landed with a soft thud. I remember looking down the driveway, expecting to see a neighbor or anyone, but it was just white walls of snow on both sides and a pale sky above. The neighborhood felt muffled, like the storm had stolen all the sound and left only a few distant shovels scraping. I backed toward the house, not taking my eyes off the snow mound. It rose again, just slightly, then settled. The hair I'd uncovered trembled like it had been tugged from below. I turned and practically ran to the front door, fumbling with the keys so hard I dropped them once into the snow on the porch. Inside, I slammed the door and locked it, then locked the chain. My hands were shaking so badly I almost couldn't dial. When I called 911, my voice sounded calm at first, like my brain was trying to protect me by pretending it wasn't real. I told the operator there might be someone buried in my driveway and that I saw hair and the snow was moving. She asked me questions and I answered them, but I kept glancing at the front windows like I expected to see the mound crawl toward the house. While I waited, I kept thinking about the garage door, the snow inside the frame, the tapping at the vent. The details lined up in my head in a way I didn't like. I walked through the kitchen and turned on every light. The house looked normal, warm, clean, with my aunt's magnets on the fridge and a bowl of fake fruit on the counter. That normalness almost made it worse. A few minutes later, I heard tires crunching outside. 2 police officers showed up in a cruiser that looked like it had fought through a snowstorm and lost. I opened the door and talked to them on the porch, pointing down the driveway. They looked tired and slightly annoyed, like they'd been getting calls all morning about downed branches and stranded cars. One of them followed me down the driveway while the other stayed closer to the road, scanning around like he expected a loose dog to pop out. I showed them the spot where the hair was. The officer crouched and brushed snow away with his glove. The hair was still there, but the mound wasn't moving anymore. It just sat, silent and heavy, like a normal drift. The officer looked up at me and asked if I was sure I saw it move. I told him yes. I told him it lifted and sank like breathing. He nodded in a way that didn't mean he believed me. He said cold air can shift snow, and sometimes you get little collapses that look like movement. Then he dug a little more. He cleared a wider patch of snow and ice around the hair, and what he uncovered made my skin crawl for a different reason. The hair wasn't attached to a head or a body. It looked like it was threaded through the snow, like it had been placed there, like someone had shoved hair into the drift on purpose. The officer's expression changed when he saw that. He stopped talking and used his shovel to dig deeper, fast, like he suddenly didn't want to waste time. The second officer joined him. They dug for several minutes, tossing snow aside until they hit something that wasn't hair or ice. It was a piece of fabric. Not thick winter fabric, thin like a shirt. The officer pulled it out and it was a plain gray t-shirt, wet and stiff from freezing. No blood, no signs of a body, just a shirt buried under the snow like it had been discarded and covered up. They kept digging and a few feet away they found a glove, then another clump of hair, separate from the first. The officers looked at each other. One of them asked me if I'd seen any footprints. I told him the snow had been blowing all night, so I couldn't tell. He stood and scanned the driveway and the yard, and his eyes locked on something near the side of the house. I followed his gaze and saw a narrow dip in the snow, like a shallow trench running along the fence line toward the backyard. Someone had moved through the snow there. The officers walked along the dip, stepping carefully, and I trailed behind them, trying not to slip. The trench led to the back corner of the yard, where the snowbank near the fence looked disturbed, like someone had climbed over. Beyond the fence was a strip of woods that separated the neighborhood from a larger road. The officer near the fence leaned down, brushing snow away, and I saw a line of footprints going into the trees. Not boot prints like mine. Smaller, lighter, almost barefoot-looking in shape, but still too neat to be an animal. Then the wind picked up, and fresh powder started dusting over them like the world was trying to erase the evidence in real time. The officers told me to go back inside and stay there. They said they were going to follow the tracks a little and call for someone else to check the area. I nodded, but my legs felt weak, like all the adrenaline was draining out at once. I went back inside and locked everything again. Then I just stood in the living room, staring at the hallway that led to the basement door. My aunt had told me the basement was unfinished and messy, and I didn't need to go down there. I hadn't planned to. But now, with hair and clothes buried in the driveway and tracks leading into the woods, I couldn't stop thinking about the vent tapping and the snow in the garage door frame. The idea that someone could have been in the house at any point during the storm made my skin feel tight. I tried calling my aunt, but it went straight to voicemail. She was probably asleep or busy with the baby. I didn't want to freak her out anyway, not without something solid to tell her. I ended up texting her a vague message that there had been an issue and police were there, and I'd explain later. That afternoon, the officers came back and said they didn't find anyone in the woods. They found the trail until it hit a plowed service road, and then it was gone. They took the shirt and glove as possible evidence, but they didn't sound confident about what it meant. One of them suggested it could be trash blown into the drift, and I wanted to yell at him, because trash doesn't breathe and it doesn't leave clumps of human hair. Before they left, I asked them if they could check the basement, just to make sure no one was inside. One officer looked at me like I was embarrassed for even asking, but the other one agreed. They walked through the house with me, opened closets, checked behind doors, and finally went down the basement stairs with flashlights. I stood at the top, listening. Even with them down there, I heard the same creaks I'd heard the night before, those slow, weight-shifting sounds. The basement was unfinished, so it should have been concrete and pipes, but the creaks still came, like they were traveling through the walls. The officers came back up after a few minutes and said they didn't see anyone. They told me if I heard anything else to call. When they left, the house felt bigger and emptier than it had that morning. The lights didn't make it feel safer. They just made it easier to see how many windows there were, how many dark corners existed when you weren't looking at them. I tried to distract myself with work, but I kept pausing to listen, and every time I listened, I swore I could hear something faint in the vents. That night, I didn't go upstairs. I dragged a blanket to the couch and slept with the TV on low, just for the noise. I kept my phone in my hand. Sometime after 1:30 a.m., I woke up because the house made a sound like a floorboard bending under weight. It came from the kitchen. I sat up slowly, every muscle tight. The TV was still on, showing some late-night infomercial, but the volume was low enough that I could hear the house. Another creak came closer, like it moved from the kitchen toward the living room. I watched the doorway, expecting to see a shadow. Instead, I heard the softest sound, like someone exhaling through their nose. It came from the floor vent by the couch. I didn't move, I didn't even blink. The vent was right there, maybe 2 feet from my hand. The metal slats were dark. The air coming out was warm, but under it I thought I could smell something damp, like wet wool and cold dirt. Then the vent cover shifted. Not lifted off, not thrown aside, just nudged like something underneath pressed against it and let go. The screw in one corner was missing, and I hadn't noticed that before. I stared at that vent like it was a mouth. Another quiet exhale came through it, and this time it sounded like someone trying not to be heard. I grabbed my phone and silently dialed 911 again. While it rang, I stood up and backed away toward the front door, keeping my eyes on the vent. The operator answered, and I whispered that I thought someone was in the vents or crawl space. I heard how insane it sounded even as I said it, but I didn't care. I told her I heard breathing and the vent moved. The next part happened so fast, I still have trouble replaying it in order. As I backed toward the door, the living room floor creaked again, but not near the vent. It was behind me, near the hallway. I turned my head just enough to see the edge of the hallway, and I saw movement low to the ground, like someone crouched and shifting. I couldn't see a face. I couldn't even see clothes clearly. I just saw a shape that didn't match any furniture, pressed close to the wall, staying out of the light. I froze, and in that split second, the shape moved again, and I heard a wet crunch of snow under a shoe. There was snow inside my aunt's house. I ran out the front door so hard I nearly slipped on the porch. I didn't stop to put on shoes. I didn't stop to grab a coat. I sprinted into the driveway where my half-dug snow trench was waiting, and I stood there shaking, staring through the living room window. The shape wasn't visible anymore. The TV glow filled the room like nothing had happened, but I saw something else that made my stomach turn. On the inside of the window, fog was forming, like someone had been standing close enough to breathe on the glass. It spread in a slow oval, then faded, then appeared again, slightly lower, like the person moved. When the police arrived, they searched the house again, more seriously this time. They found the basement door unlocked. I knew I hadn't opened it. They found a missing vent screw on the living room floor, right where I had seen it. And in the basement, behind a stack of old storage bins, they found a small gap in the insulation where something had been pushed aside, leading into the crawl space under the house. They didn't find anyone. The officers told me it was possible someone had broken in during the storm, used the basement and crawl space to stay hidden, and slipped out when I ran outside. One of them said people do desperate things in bad weather, especially if they don't have a place to go. He said it like it was supposed to make me feel better, like calling it desperate made it less terrifying. I didn't stay another night. I packed my laptop in my bag while the police were still there, and I left to a friend's apartment across town. My aunt came back 2 days later, furious and scared, and she had new locks installed on every door. She also had a company come inspect the crawl space and vents. They told her the crawl space access panel outside had been tampered with, like someone had pried it open and forced their way under the house. They also found a flattened area in the insulation where someone could have laid down. The last thing happened a week later, after another light snowfall that covered everything with a clean layer again. My aunt called me, and her voice sounded tight. She said she had found something in the driveway, near where I'd been digging. It was a neat little mound of snow, shaped almost like someone had scooped it into a pile by hand. Sticking out of the top was a single dark clump of hair, placed like a marker. And beside it, pressed into the fresh snow like a fingerprint, was a shallow, slow-rising dip, as if something underneath it had just taken a quiet breath. It was the first snowed-in stay at a roadside motel I spent completely alone. I thought the silence would be peaceful, until I realized it wasn't silence at all. I'm Brandon Kay, and this happened a couple winters ago when I was driving across Pennsylvania on a work trip I shouldn't have taken in the first place. I still don't like talking about it, mostly because I don't know if it's really over. I've been on the highway for hours, watching the world slowly disappear behind a curtain of snow. At first it was light flurries, the kind you barely notice under the headlights. Then the wind picked up and the flakes got thick and heavy, hitting the windshield so fast it felt like someone was dumping buckets of white sand in front of my car. The lane lines faded until I was basically guessing where the road was. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tight my hands hurt. Every time a semi passed me, the blast of wind made my little sedan sway, and I had to correct it like I was steering a boat. My phone kept dropping signal, and my GPS started lagging behind my actual location. I told myself I just needed to find a place to sleep, even if it was some cheap motel, then wait out the storm. Around 10:46 p.m., I saw a glowing sign through the snow, half buried behind blowing drifts. It looked old, the kind with flickering letters. It said motel, and underneath it, vacancy, but the A in vacancy was dark, so it read like VCNCY. The entrance was a narrow driveway with tire tracks already filling in. The parking lot was almost empty. There were maybe 4 cars total, all parked close to the building like they wanted to be near the lights. The motel itself was one long, low rectangle with brown doors and small windows. The whole place looked like it hadn't been updated since the 90s, but right then it might as well have been a palace. I parked, turned off the engine, and just sat there listening to the wind. The snow hissed across the hood, and my headlights lit up nothing but swirling white. When I finally opened the door, the cold hit me like a punch. My breath came out in thick clouds as I hurried to the office, shoulders hunched, suitcase dragging behind me through the slush. The lobby was tiny, with a counter that had a scratched plastic shield on top like the kind you'd see at a gas station. There was a bell, a stack of brochures for local attractions that looked sun-faded, and a little bowl of mints that seemed like they'd been sitting there for years. Behind the counter, a man sat in a chair, facing slightly away from me. He didn't look up when I came in. I rang the bell once. The sound was too loud in the quiet room. The clerk turned his head slowly, like he was annoyed I'd interrupted something, but his face didn't change. He was pale, maybe late 50s, with thin hair combed straight back. He stared at me for a long second, then slid a key across the counter without saying a word. At first I thought I'd missed something, like maybe he'd already checked me in somehow. I said, how much for the night? He just pointed to a sign taped to the counter that said a price in marker. I nodded, pulled out my card, and held it up. He didn't take it. He pushed a clipboard toward me with a guest form that had a pen tied to it. I wrote my name, my license plate, and my address, then slid it back. The clerk took it, glanced down, and wrote something in a little book beside him. Still no words. Then he pointed down a hallway to my left, the one that led to the rooms. The key had a metal tag that said 8. I thanked him anyway, mostly out of habit, and headed down the hall. That was when I noticed something that didn't make sense. The hallway felt warm. Not the heaters on warm, but warm like stepping inside a building in July after walking through a parking lot in the sun. The air had that heavy, slightly dusty heat to it, and it smelled faintly like sunscreen or something sweet. I stopped and looked back toward the lobby, expecting maybe a blast of heat was coming from a vent, but the lobby felt normal, like any heated indoor space in winter. The moment I stepped fully into the hallway, it was like I'd walked into a different season. I could feel my cheeks stop stinging from the cold, and my hands loosened because they weren't numb anymore. The hallway was carpeted, and the carpet pattern was weird, like these faded shapes that reminded me of palm trees. I remember thinking that was a strange choice for a motel in the middle of a snowstorm. The lights overhead were those long yellowish ones that buzz faintly, and every door was the same dull brown, each with a little number screwed into it. I found room 8 about halfway down. The key slid in smoothly like it was new. When I opened the door, the room itself was colder than the hallway, but not freezing. It was a basic setup: 2 beds, a small TV, a table with a chair, and a bathroom that smelled like bleach. The curtains were drawn tight, and the only sound was the low hum of the heater under the window. I dropped my suitcase, kicked off my shoes, and sat on the edge of the bed. For a minute I just listened. The storm outside was muffled, like the building was wrapped in thick insulation. I should have felt relieved, but instead I had this uneasy feeling, like I'd walked into somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. I told myself I was being dramatic because I was tired. I took a quick shower, changed into a t-shirt and sweatpants, and laid in bed scrolling my phone. No signal, not even one bar. I tried the motel Wi-Fi, but it wouldn't connect. I even tried calling just to see if it would go through, and my phone immediately said call failed. That's when I heard it for the first time. A soft step in the hallway, slow and careful, like someone walking in socks. Then another. Then a pause right outside my door. I held my breath without meaning to. After a few seconds, the steps moved on, continuing down the hall at the same slow pace. I waited, staring at the door, expecting maybe a knock. Nothing. The footsteps faded, then stopped again somewhere farther down. I told myself it was another guest, maybe someone checking if there was an ice machine or something. Still, it didn't feel right, mostly because the hallway had been empty when I came in. I tried to sleep, but the warmth from the hall kept bothering me. It didn't seep into the room, which made it worse, like a line had been drawn at my door. At some point I must have drifted off because I woke up suddenly with my heart racing. I don't know what time it was yet, but the room was quiet and dark, and I could hear that soft stepping again. This time it didn't move past. It stopped right outside my door and stayed there. I sat up, listening so hard it felt like my ears were straining. Then came a sound I can only describe as someone pressing their fingers lightly against the door, not knocking, just touching it. I stared at the peephole, feeling like if I moved I'd give myself away. After maybe a minute, the pressure sound stopped. I heard the steps move away again, slow as before. When I finally checked my phone, it said 3:52 a.m. I didn't go back to sleep after that. I just sat with the lamp on, pretending I was waiting for morning on purpose. When the gray light finally started showing through the edges of the curtains, I felt this huge wave of relief. Morning meant normal life. Morning meant the storm would be calmer and I could leave this place behind. I packed my bag, pulled on my coat, and stepped into the hallway. It was still warm. Actually, it felt warmer than the night before, like someone had cranked the heat up. I could have walked out there in shorts. I remember staring at the carpet again, those faded palm tree shapes, and feeling stupidly angry about it. Like the motel was mocking me with summer while the world outside was buried in snow. I walked toward the lobby, dragging my suitcase. The hallway seemed longer than it had been when I arrived, not in a dramatic way, but enough that I noticed. My footsteps sounded dull on the carpet, and the buzzing lights overhead seemed louder in the morning quiet. When I reached the end, I pushed open the door that led to the lobby, or at least I thought it did. I stepped through and I froze. I was still in the hallway. It wasn't the same spot I'd been in either. I was standing near the middle again, facing a row of doors I hadn't paid attention to before. For a second, my brain couldn't accept it, like it was waiting for the lobby to appear if I blinked enough times. But all I saw was the same warm hallway, the same carpet, the same buzzing lights. I spun around and looked behind me, expecting to see the door I'd just come through. I did see a door, but it was just another brown motel door with a number on it. 8, my room. Like I'd walked out of my room and somehow ended up walking out of my room again. I actually laughed once, a short, confused sound, because it was so ridiculous. I grabbed the handle of my door and yanked. It opened into my room. My bag was still inside, the bed still unmade, the lamp still on like I'd left it. I stood there with the door open, staring into my own room, then back at the hallway like I could catch it changing. I forced myself to do the logical thing. I walked down the hallway again, faster this time, suitcase bumping behind me. I found the door at the end, pushed it open, and stepped through. Warm air, carpet, buzzing lights, hallway again. My stomach dropped like I'd missed a step on stairs. I abandoned the suitcase and started moving faster, checking doors. I found a door labeled exit in red letters near the far end. I pushed it open and stepped through. Hallway, same warmth, same lights. I turned around and the exit door was gone, replaced by another plain brown motel door like it had never existed. My throat got tight and I realized I was sweating inside my coat. I started trying to keep track, looking for something unique. A stain on the carpet, a crack in the wall, a certain light that flickered. But the hallway kept presenting the same bland sameness, like it was resetting every time I tried to leave. I finally ran to the lobby door again, and this time I planted my hand on the wall beside it just to keep a point of contact. I pushed the door open while keeping my palm pressed to the wall. The moment I stepped through, my hand slid off paint and onto the same wall, the same cheap beige paint, the same faint smell of warm dust. I was back, and the door behind me clicked shut like it was satisfied. I stood there breathing hard, trying not to panic. Then I realized something else. The hallway was empty, no footsteps, no doors opening, no TV sounds, no voices. It was like I was the only person in the whole building, even though I'd seen cars in the parking lot last night. I called out, "Hello." My voice sounded wrong in that heat, like it got swallowed. I walked to the nearest door, knocked, and waited. No answer. I knocked again, louder, then tried the handle. Locked. I moved to the next door, then the next, knocking and shaking handles. Every door was locked, and every room was silent. I went back to my room and grabbed the landline phone on the nightstand. I picked it up and listened. There was a dial tone which actually gave me hope for half a second. I dialed 911. The phone rang once, twice, then clicked. A man's voice came on, calm and flat. "Front desk." I just stared at the phone. I said, "No, I need the police. I'm stuck. I can't get out." There was a pause, like the line had gone dead. Then the same voice said, "Front desk." It sounded exactly the same, like a recording. I hung up and tried calling a friend, then my mom, then anyone. Every number did the same thing. 1 ring, 2 rings, click, front desk. The last time I tried, I yelled into the receiver, "Where are you?" And I swear I heard a soft breathing sound on the other end before it clicked off. I needed proof that I wasn't losing it. I pulled back the curtains, expecting to see the parking lot, my car, the snow. Instead, I saw brightness, not snow glare, brightness like a sunny afternoon. The glass looked slightly fogged, and beyond it was just a pale, washed-out light that made it impossible to see any details. I pressed my face close to the window and wiped a clear spot with my sleeve. For a moment, I thought I saw movement out there, like a shape passing behind the brightness. Then the fog on the window crept back over the spot I'd wiped, slowly covering it like the glass was breathing. I backed away, heart pounding, and that's when I noticed the heater under the window wasn't on. The little light that showed it was running was dark. I put my hand near the vent anyway. Warm air was still coming out, steady and quiet. The room shouldn't have been warm, but it was getting warmer by the minute. I decided if the doors wouldn't let me out, I'd make my own way. The bathroom had a small vent near the ceiling, one of those cheap plastic grates. I stood on the toilet and pried at it with the edge of my key tag until it popped off. Behind it was a dark opening, and I could feel warm air pushing out like a breath. I shined my phone flashlight up there. The vent was big enough that maybe, if I forced it, I could crawl. The idea sounded insane, but the thought of staying in that place was worse. I pulled myself up, shoved my shoulders in, and started wriggling forward, scraping my elbows against metal. The farther I went, the hotter it got. It didn't feel like attic heat. It felt like walking toward an open oven. My phone light shook in my hand, and I could hear my own breathing echoing in the duct. Then, ahead of me, I heard something else. A slow scraping, like someone else moving in the metal tunnel, but coming toward me. I froze so hard I almost slipped backward. The scraping stopped too, like whatever it was had frozen when I did. For a few seconds there was nothing but the hum of warm air and my heartbeat. Then, very softly, I heard a sound that made my skin go cold. It was my name, Brandon, not shouted, not whispered exactly, just spoken like someone testing how it sounded in their mouth. It came from ahead of me in the dark, and it sounded close enough that I could picture a face inches away, even though I couldn't see anything. I panicked and shoved myself backward, scraping my ribs and knees, not caring about the pain. I dropped back into the bathroom and landed hard on the tile, gasping. I slammed the vent cover back into place even though it wouldn't stay, like that would somehow keep it in. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped my phone. I grabbed my jacket, my wallet, my keys, and my phone, and I bolted into the hallway. I didn't even know what I was doing anymore. I just needed movement, needed to not be trapped in that room with the window that showed nothing. The hallway heat hit me like a wall, and I started running, checking every door again, looking for anything different. As I ran, I noticed something I hadn't before. The door numbers weren't changing the way they should. I'd pass room 8, then room 9, then room 10, then room 8 again, like the hallway was folding back on itself. I stopped and stared at the second 8, and I saw fresh scratches around the lock, like someone had jammed a key in too hard. That's when I realized those scratches might have been mine, or someone else who had tried to get out the same way. My mouth went dry. I stepped closer and saw something else, right above the peephole, carved lightly into the paint like it had been done with a small, sharp object. It said, "Don't sleep." I stood there reading it over and over, trying to make my brain accept it. Then I heard the footsteps again. Soft, slow, coming from behind me. I turned my head, and at the far end of the hallway, under the buzzing light, I saw a figure standing still. It looked like a man about average height, wearing something dark. I couldn't see his face, but I could tell he was facing me. The warmth made the air shimmer slightly, like heat rising off asphalt, and it made his outline wobble. He didn't move at first. He just stood there like he'd been waiting for me to notice him. I took a step back without thinking, and the figure took a step forward at the same time. Not fast, just matching me, like he didn't need to rush. I turned and ran, not caring where I was going, just wanting distance. The hallway seemed to stretch, the lights repeating over and over, the doors blurring past. I slammed into an exit sign I hadn't seen before and threw myself through the door. For half a second I felt cold air, real cold air, and I almost cried from relief. I stumbled forward and opened my eyes wide, expecting snow and a parking lot. Instead, I was standing in the hallway again, but everything was slightly different. The carpet pattern was sharper, like it had been cleaned. The air was even warmer, and right in front of me on the wall was a framed picture I hadn't seen anywhere else in the motel. It was a beach scene, blue water, white sand, palm trees, and in the corner of the picture, barely noticeable unless you looked close, was a tiny motel building with a brown hallway running through it like a tunnel. There was a little figure standing in that hallway, facing out toward the viewer. I leaned in, and my stomach twisted when I realized the figure in the picture was wearing the same jacket as me. I don't remember deciding to do it, but I grabbed the frame and smashed it against the wall until the glass shattered. My hands got cut, but I barely felt it. Behind the picture wasn't drywall. It was a hole, like the wall wasn't finished there. Warm air rushed out, stronger than anywhere else, and I could hear a faint sound like distant traffic. I shoved my arm into the opening, expecting wood or insulation. My hand went into empty space. I widened the hole with my forearm, then my shoulder, scraping hard, and I forced my head through. For a second it felt like my skull was being squeezed, like the wall was trying to hold me. Then I tumbled forward and landed on something wet and cold. I was outside. I laid there for a second, face pressed into snow, breathing like I'd just run a mile. The cold was brutal, but it was real, and I loved it. I pushed myself up and saw the motel parking lot, the same flickering sign, the same snow whipping sideways in the wind. My car was there, half covered, exactly where I'd parked it. I didn't even look back at the building. I sprinted to my car, fumbled the keys, and got inside. I started the engine and sat there shaking, waiting for it to warm up enough to drive. My hands were bleeding onto the steering wheel, and I didn't care. I just wanted the road, any road, away from that place. As I pulled out, my headlights swept across the motel office window. For a split second, I saw the clerk standing inside, staring out at me. He didn't wave, he didn't blink, and I could have sworn the glass between us looked fogged, like the inside of the building was still stuck in some kind of heat. I drove until I found a truck stop with lights and people and a working phone signal. I called the police and told them I'd gotten trapped in a motel during the storm, that something was wrong there, that I'd panicked and broken through a wall. The officer sounded tired and skeptical, like he thought I was on something. He said they'd send someone to check when the roads were safer. Later that week, I looked up the motel online. I couldn't find it. Not a listing, not a review, not even a mention. I went on satellite maps and searched the stretch of highway I'd been on, and there was nothing where it should have been. Just trees and a blank strip of snow-covered land like the place had never existed. But I still have the key tag. It's sitting in a drawer in my apartment right now, the metal worn and scratched, the number 8 still stamped into it. And sometimes, late at night, when my heat kicks on and the air gets a little too warm, I swear I can smell sunscreen for a second, and I can almost hear soft footsteps outside my bedroom door, moving slow like they're in no hurry at all. My roommate traveled a lot for work around the blizzard, so when I heard him talking in his room at 3 a.m., I knew something was wrong. He wasn't home. I was alone in my apartment, listening to the wind hit the glass. I didn't know the storm was about to make my place feel like the wrong door. I was 26 and living in a third-floor unit in a tired brick apartment building outside Chicago. It was the kind of place where every door looked the same and the hallway always smelled like old carpet and laundry soap. That night a real blizzard hit, the kind that makes the windows shake and turns the streetlights into glowing white blobs. Jake had left that morning for a job 2 hours away, so it was just me, the wind, and a building full of people I didn't really know. I tried to keep busy, but the storm made everything feel close and trapped. The power flickered once around 9 p.m., and the hallway light outside my peephole dimmed for a second before buzzing back to life. I checked my deadbolt, then the chain, even though I never used the chain. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I still slept on the couch with my phone in my hand. Arya texted me earlier that night, complaining about the weather and sending a picture of snow piled against her window. She moved recently and I hadn't even visited the new place yet because work got in the way and she kept saying it was no big deal. I remember teasing her about being jumpy and she replied with one of those nervous jokes like, "If I disappear, you'll know why." I rolled my eyes at it at the time because that's how siblings are. A little after 1 a.m. my phone buzzed so hard it woke me up. It was a FaceTime call from Arya. She almost never FaceTimed, especially late, and the second I answered I knew something was wrong. Her face was pale and wet like she'd been crying, and she was whispering so quietly I could barely hear her. "Don't talk," she said, "just watch." She flipped the camera and I saw a hallway, beige walls, a long runner rug, brown doors with cheap number plates. The camera was shaky like she was crouched behind something, trying to stay hidden. Then the picture steadied on one door. The number on it was 3B. That was my apartment number. My brain stalled like it couldn't decide what to do with that. Arya lived across town. She wasn't in my building. She couldn't be. But the door on the screen had the same scuffed paint near the handle, the same little scratch along the frame where Jake's keys always hit. Arya whispered, "Someone's outside my door." I heard them in the hallway, and then the knob started moving. On the screen, the doorknob was still for a second. Then it turned slowly, not like a nervous check, but like someone was taking their time. The latch clicked, and the door eased inward until it hit the chain. "My chain." Arya sucked in a breath, and the phone dipped like she almost dropped it. I felt my stomach turn to ice. I slid off the couch and walked to my front door without taking my eyes off the screen. I kept the lights off, moving on memory, because I didn't want whoever was outside to know exactly where I was. When I got close enough to my door, I heard it in real life. A soft rattle, a quiet scrape of metal. The same chain sound I was hearing through Arya's phone. My chest tightened so hard I could barely breathe. I whispered, "Arya, I'm at my door. It's happening here too." There was a long pause, then she whispered, "No, that doesn't make sense." The pressure on my chain eased like whoever was outside had stepped back. For a few seconds everything went still. Even through the storm noise, that silence felt wrong, like the moment after a car stops behind you and you realize it's not passing. Then there were 3 gentle knocks on my door. Not hard, not angry, just polite, like someone who expected me to open it. A second later, Arya flinched on the screen like she heard the exact same knock. I glanced at my phone bars, full service. Arya whispered she had no service at all and that she'd tried calling the police but it wouldn't go through. That made no sense either. If she had no signal, how was I seeing her hallway so clearly, and why was the audio so clean? I tried one stupid thing before calling the cops. I leaned into my peephole and looked out. The hallway was empty. No person, no shadow, no movement. Just the buzzing light and the old runner rug stretching to the stairwell. I called 911, keeping FaceTime running. The operator sounded tired and stressed, like my call was one of 100 because of the blizzard. She asked for my address and I gave it, then asked her to send someone to my sister too. Arya whispered her address to me. It was my address. Same street, same building. I felt my heart drop. I told the operator my sister didn't live with me, and she asked if we were safe, like she was trying to figure out if this was a domestic situation. I didn't mention the FaceTime showing my own door, because I could hear how crazy it sounded out loud. She said officers would come when they could, but the roads were bad. While I waited, I stood back from the door with a baseball bat Jake kept by the coat rack. I didn't shout, I didn't threaten, I didn't even move, because the smallest sound felt like giving away my position. On the phone, Arya stayed crouched somewhere in the stairwell, barely breathing, listening for footsteps. That's when the voice came from my hallway. "Hey man," Jake's voice said, muffled through my door. "You up?" Every hair on my arm stood up. Jake was 2 hours away. He texted me earlier from a hotel. There was no way he was outside my apartment right then. "Open up," the voice said, still calm. "I forgot my key." Arya whispered into the phone. "I hear it too. It sounds like you." I didn't answer either of them. I just stared at the deadbolt like it was the only thing between me and a mistake I couldn't take back. The voice outside laughed softly, the exact way Jake laughed when he was messing with me, and then it said my name again, drawn out and wrong, like it didn't fit the mouth saying it. Then the chain on my door pulled tight. Not from the door pushing in, but like something was tugging the chain from the other side. I watched it, my eyes locked on the metal, and I couldn't understand what I was seeing. The chain latch is on the inside. Nobody in the hallway can reach it. Something slid under my door. At first I thought it was a note, but it was glossy and stiff, and when it reached the light from my phone screen, I saw it was a photograph. I snatched it up without thinking and flipped it over. It was a picture of my front door, taken from the hallway, with the number 3B centered in the frame. And in the peephole reflection, faint but clear enough, was my face, staring straight back like I'd been standing there when the photo was taken. Behind me on the FaceTime audio, I heard a slow click, like a lock turning. Arya's video froze, then the screen went black, but the call didn't end. I could still hear something on the line, footsteps on carpet, stopping, then the soft metal scrape of a chain being undone. At the same time, my doorknob turned from my side. I jumped back so hard I hit the wall. The latch clicked and the door eased inward until the chain stopped it, the crack opening just enough to let in a slice of freezing air. The hallway light outside was out now, leaving only darkness on the other side. From the phone speaker, a whisper breath, 3B. Then down the hall I heard a door open and a man's voice yell, "Who's out there?" like he'd finally noticed something was wrong. I heard boots on carpet, fast and heavy, and a second later I saw flashlight beams sweep under my door. The pressure on the chain vanished like it had never been there, and the crack eased shut on its own, soft as a careful hand. The police showed up not long after that, annoyed, soaked, and clearly expecting to find nothing. They walked the hallway, checked the stairwell, and asked a few neighbors if they'd seen anyone. Nobody had. There were no footprints in the carpet, no signs of forced entry, nothing to point at. One officer looked at my photo and handed it back without a word, like he didn't want to touch it too long. After they left, I checked my call history, hoping I'd see something normal, like Arya's number, a clear time stamp, anything. The FaceTime call wasn't there. Not missed, not answered, not even in the recent list. The only thing I had was a screenshot my phone said I took, even though I never hit the button, and the screenshot was just black, like a camera pointed into a closet. Arya didn't answer my calls for hours. When she finally did, her voice was thin and tired. She said she wasn't at home anymore, she was at a friend's place, but she couldn't explain how she got there. She remembered hiding in the stairwell, hearing someone move above her, then hearing a voice she swore sounded like me asking her to come back to the door. I asked her again about her move, trying to anchor it in something real. She reminded me, annoyed even through the fear, that she'd signed a lease a month earlier for an apartment she said was finally quiet. She said the unit number was 3B, and she said the address was the one she'd whispered that night. She kept repeating, "That's what my mail says," like the mail was the only proof she trusted. The next day, when the streets were clear enough, I drove to the address. It was my building, same lobby, same mailboxes, same stale heat. But when I looked at the tenant list taped by the boxes, neither my name nor Arya McConnell was on it. I walked to the third floor anyway, because I felt like I had to. The hallway looked right, but the door at 3B was painted a different shade than mine, and the number plate was crooked like someone had rushed to put it up. I stood there for a long time, listening, half expecting to hear my own TV through the wood. I didn't knock, I turned to leave. That's when I saw a fresh photograph taped low to the doorframe, right above the carpet. It showed me asleep on my couch during the storm, my phone glowing on the table, my front door in the background. The angle was from inside my apartment, like the person taking it had been standing in my hallway. On the back, written in neat black ink, were 2 words, "Wrong door." And ever since that blizzard, when my phone rings late at night, I don't answer it by default, because sometimes, in the thin silence before it goes to voicemail, I swear I can hear my own voice whispering through the door, asking me to let me in. I found a hidden folder on my laptop one morning after we found those tracks behind my house. When I opened it, the pictures inside showed me sleeping, every single night. I didn't understand how a problem in the woods could end up inside my bedroom. This happened last winter when I was living in a rental house on the edge of a small town in northern Michigan. Behind my backyard was a strip of trees and then miles of state woods, the kind of place kids call the trail even though it's just deer paths. I worked from home, kept to myself, and the only thing I did every night without fail was take my dog, Ranger, out before bed. That routine is what made it so easy for something to learn me. It started the morning after a heavy snowfall. Everything looked clean and bright, and the neighborhood was dead quiet like it was still asleep under the snow. Ranger begged to go out, so I clipped his leash on and stepped into the backyard in my boots and a hoodie. Halfway across the yard, he stopped and stared at the tree line, ears straight up. That's when I saw the prints. There was one set of tracks cutting across the yard toward the broken fence at the back. Not deer tracks, not paw prints from a dog, not messy lines like someone running. They were deep, wide, and spaced far apart, like whatever made them was heavy and took long steps. Each print was wider than my boot, and the edges were clean like it hadn't been dragging anything. The strangest part was there was only one trail, like it walked in a straight line and never hesitated. Ranger lowered his nose and followed them like he recognized the smell. He wasn't excited the way he was with rabbits. He was focused, tail low, pulling just enough that I had to lean back. At the fence, the tracks went through a gap in the slats and into the woods, and Ranger tried to go with them. I told myself it was a bear and I was being dramatic, but I didn't step through the gap. I stood there, staring into the dark trees, waiting for a bird call or a squirrel sound that never came. For the rest of that day, Ranger kept watching the back windows. Every so often he'd huff and pace like he wanted to check the door again. I texted my neighbor, an older guy named Mr. Henley, and asked if he'd seen anything big back there. He said, probably coyotes, then added, if you see prints that don't make sense, don't follow them. It felt like advice he'd given himself before. That night I took Ranger out front instead of the backyard, under the streetlights. When we went to bed, I left the porch light on and kept my phone on the nightstand. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound like slow scratching on the outside wall, then a pause, then scratching again. Ranger was already sitting up, staring at the bedroom door with his lips pulled back. I checked my phone and saw it was 1:13 a.m., and my heart started beating hard enough that it felt loud. I crept to the window and lifted a corner of the blinds. The porch light lit up the snow, but the woods beyond the fence were just a black line. At the edge of the light, right where it faded into shadow, something moved behind a tree. It wasn't a clear shape, more like a tall patch of darkness shifting as if it knew where the light ended. Ranger growled low, and the scratching stopped immediately. A few seconds later, I heard slow crunching footsteps in the snow, not in my yard, but inside the woods. In the morning, I went outside as soon as it was light. The porch steps were clean, but near the fence, the same heavy prints were there again, fresher than yesterday. They came out of the woods and stopped at the back steps like whoever made them had stood there. There were no prints going back the other way, just one line coming in, ending at my house, like it didn't need to leave the same way it arrived. I called the non-emergency number and tried to explain it without sounding crazy. A deputy showed up, glanced at the tracks, and shrugged. He said it was probably a big dog or maybe a bear, and he told me to keep my doors locked and my trash sealed. When I asked why there were no return tracks, he said the wind can cover things up, even though the snow was smooth and untouched. He didn't step into the woods, and he didn't stay long. After that, the tracks started showing up more often. Sometimes they crossed my yard and stopped under my kitchen window. Sometimes they circled my shed like something was checking for a way in. Ranger stopped wanting to go outside at night at all, even out front. If I opened the back door, he'd plant his paws and tremble, staring past me like he could see something I couldn't. I bought a motion light and a cheap camera and pointed it at the back fence. The first 2 nights, nothing happened, and I almost relaxed. On the 3rd night, the motion light came on around 2:50 a.m. and stayed on. I checked the camera feed on my phone and saw the yard bright and empty, but the picture kept glitching, freezing for a second at a time like the signal was being interrupted. Then the feed went black for a full minute, and when it came back, the snow under the fence looked disturbed, like something had lined there. The next morning, the tracks were back, deeper than before. They started at the fence and went straight to my back door. The last print wasn't in the snow at all. It was a wet impression on the wooden porch boards, darker than the rest, like something warm and damp had pressed down there. I stood staring at it while Ranger whined behind me, and all I could think was that whatever was coming out of those woods had learned my routine. That afternoon I did the dumb thing and went into the woods in daylight, just far enough to prove to myself it was an animal. Ranger didn't pull this time. He crept, stopping every few steps to listen, and the whole forest felt wrong, like someone had turned the volume down. The tracks led to a patch of brush near a fallen log where the snow was scraped away in a wide oval. The air smelled sour and wet, like a kennel that hadn't been cleaned, and Ranger backed up and refused to go closer. I heard a slow exhale from somewhere off to my right, not loud, but close enough that I felt it in my teeth. Ranger's growl turned into a bark, and I didn't wait to see anything. I yanked him back the way we came, slipping in the snow, not stopping until my yard was in sight. When we got inside, I locked the door and sat on the kitchen floor with Ranger pressed against my leg, shaking like I'd just run miles. That night was the worst. Around 4:22 a.m., Ranger started growling at the hallway instead of the back door. I sat up in bed and saw a shadow slide across the floor outside my room, low and smooth, like something moving without lifting its feet. Ranger slammed into my bedroom door barking, and then the doorknob on the other side turned, slow and deliberate, like someone testing it. I didn't breathe until it stopped. When the sun came up, I opened the door and found wet marks on the carpet right outside, spaced like prints. They led down the hall toward the back door, but the deadbolt was still locked. I went to my office to grab my laptop and call in sick, and that's when I noticed a file window already open on the screen. There was a folder with a random name I didn't recognize, like it had been made by a program. I clicked it, and my stomach dropped. Inside were pictures of me sleeping. The angle was from inside my room, not from a webcam, and my laptop doesn't even have one. In some photos, the flash lit up the walls so bright I could see every wrinkle in my sheets. In one, Ranger was awake, staring straight at the camera with his ears pinned back like he'd been too scared to move. The newest photo was timestamped less than an hour earlier, and it showed the doorway of my bedroom with a tall shape filling it, just a darker darkness against the dark. I didn't stay another night. I packed what I could, got Ranger in the car, and drove to my sister's apartment across town. Later that day, I went back with her boyfriend to grab the rest, and the house looked normal until we stepped onto the porch. In the snow below the steps, the same single set of tracks led from the fence to my door, and once again there were no tracks leading away. It looked like something had walked up to my house and simply stopped existing. I broke the lease and moved into an apartment closer to the center of town where there were lights and neighbors everywhere. I wiped my laptop, changed every password I had, and tried to convince myself it had been a person messing with me, someone sick who liked scaring people. But I couldn't make the tracks fit that answer, and I couldn't explain the smell in the woods or the way Ranger had acted like he recognized it. For a while, things went quiet, and I almost started believing I was safe again. Even there, I couldn't stop acting like someone was outside my door. I bought a cheap door bar, put little bells on the knob like a paranoid kid, and taped a strip of paper over the peephole so I'd know if anyone touched it. Ranger started doing this thing where he'd wake up, sniff the air once, and then stare at the front door without making a sound. One afternoon I came home, and the hallway outside my unit smelled faintly like wet animal, even though the carpet was dry and clean. The next day the smell was gone, and when I asked the building manager, he just said, "Probably someone's dog," and walked away. Then one rainy evening I took Ranger out behind the apartment to the little patch of grass by the dumpsters. He sniffed around, did his business, and suddenly froze, ears up, nose dropping like it had that first morning. Along the fence line in the mud was one trail of deep, wide prints leading toward the dark gap between buildings. There were no prints going back. I dragged Ranger inside, locked the door, and sat with him in the hallway until my hands stopped shaking. At 3:36 a.m., my phone buzzed with a notification from my cloud storage account. It said a new file had been uploaded from a device I didn't recognize, and the file name was just a string of letters and numbers like before. I stared at the screen for a long time, not opening it because I already knew what I was going to see. The only thing I could think about was that somewhere outside, something had left tracks that never turned back, and somehow it had found me again.